The tray shook in Elena Voss's hands, but not one bottle fell. She had been standing in the doorway of the great hall for only a few seconds, carrying medicine for a wounded guard, when she heard her own name spoken by the man she loved. She did not move. She did not breathe. She only listened. "She means nothing," Damien Blackthorne said, his voice carrying easily across the stone hall, loud enough for every council member, every guard, and every servant to hear. Just a servant who's useful, nothing more. The visiting Alpha, a broad man named Colin Ashgrove, laughed and raised his cup in agreement, as if Damien had said something clever instead of something cruel. The council members chuckled along with him, because that was what people did when a king spoke. They agreed. Elena stood in the doorway with the tray still balanced in her hands, and something inside her chest went very still, like a candle flame caught between two closing fingers. She did not cry. She would not give him that. She walked forward, set the tray on the long table exactly where she had been asked to set it, and left the hall without a single word. Nobody noticed her leave. That, more than anything he had said, was the truth she carried with her down the corridor. For 3 years, Elena had served the Blackthorne pack as a healer. She had stitched wounds after border skirmishes, brewed remedies for fevers that swept through the lower village, and sat awake through countless nights, beside soldiers, who might not have lived until morning. She had done this quietly, without complaint, because healing was the only thing she had ever been good at, and because, somewhere along the way, without meaning to, she had fallen in love with the man who ruled over all of it. She remembered the day she met him. She had been 16, gathering herbs near the eastern ridge, when a rogue wolf attacked her caravan. Damien, then a young heir not yet crowned, had arrived with his guard and driven the attacker away himself. He had knelt beside her in the dirt, checked that she was breathing, and carried her back to the castle in his own arms. She had watched him from that day forward, the way one watches the sun, carefully, and always at a distance, because looking too directly could burn. She had never told him how she felt. She never needed to say it aloud, because she believed, in some quiet and foolish part of her heart, that he already knew. That the way he sought her out after difficult days, the way he trusted only her hands with his own wounds, meant something. She told herself that kings did not have to say such things out loud, that patience was its own kind of promise. She walked to her small chamber near the healer's wing and closed the door behind her. She did not light a candle. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the dark and let the silence settle over her like a blanket that did not quite keep out the cold. She means nothing. The words did not fade. They repeated themselves in her mind, over and over, in his voice, in that same easy tone he might have used to comment on the weather. Nothing about the way he had said it suggested cruelty. That was what made it worse. He had not been trying to hurt her. He simply had not thought of her as someone who could be hurt at all. She thought of the years of quiet devotion she had given him, and she understood, finally and completely, that devotion given freely to someone who does not notice it is not a gift. It is simply lost. By morning, Elena had made a decision, though she did not yet know how deeply it would reshape her life. She would continue her duties. She would not weep in front of anyone. But something in her had shifted, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years, and she would not pretend, even to herself, that the door had not opened. She rose before dawn and went to the healer's hall to prepare the day's remedies. Grace, an older healer, who had trained her since childhood, noticed the change in her immediately. "You look like you did not sleep," Grace said, not unkindly, as she ground herbs into a fine paste. "I slept enough," Elena answered, though it was not true. Grace studied her for a long moment, then set down her pestle. Word travels fast in a castle, with thin walls and thinner loyalties. I heard what was said in the hall last night. Elena's hands stilled over the bandages she was folding. "It does not matter." "It matters to you," Grace said gently. "I have watched you follow that man with your eyes for 3 years, child. You do not have to pretend with me." Elena felt the sting behind her eyes, and blinked it away. "He is the Alpha King. I am a healer. That is the whole of it. It was foolish of me to imagine anything more." "It was not foolish to hope," Grace said. "It is only foolish to keep hoping, once the truth has been spoken plainly to your face. And it has now, hasn't it?" Elena did not answer, because there was nothing to say that would not break something loose inside her. and she needed to remain steady for the work ahead of her. There were wounds to tend, fevers to check, and a border camp 2 days' ride away that had sent word of soldiers needing care after a skirmish with a neighboring territory. 2 days later, Elena found herself standing before Damien in his private study, summoned there, along with 2 other healers, to discuss the assignment. "The border camp at Thornridge needs additional healers," Damien said, not looking up from the map spread across his desk. "There have been injuries in the recent conflict with the Ashworth remnants. I am sending 3 of you for 2 weeks." Elena kept her expression carefully composed. This was the first time she had been in the same room as him since the night in the hall, and she found, with some surprise, that she felt nothing but a cold, distant calm. The warmth she had always carried toward him, the eagerness to be near him, had gone quiet, as if it had never existed at all. "I will go," she said, before either of the other healers could volunteer. Damien finally looked up, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his face, something she might once have read as concern, but it passed too quickly for her to be certain, and she told herself it did not matter either way. "Good," he said simply, and returned his attention to the map. She left the study without another word, and if he noticed the absence of warmth in her voice, he gave no sign of it. Kings, she thought bitterly, rarely notice the temperature of things that mean nothing to them. The journey to Thornridge took 2 full days on horseback, through forested hills and along winding rivers that marked the uneasy border between Blackthorn territory and the lands once held by the Ashworth pack before its fall from power. Elena rode with Grace and a younger healer named Bethany, and for most of the journey she said very little, letting the rhythm of the horse's steps carry her thoughts, far from the castle she had left behind. Thornridge Camp was a rough collection of tents and wooden shelters built along a defensible ridge overlooking the river. Soldiers moved between posts with the tired efficiency of men and women who had been fighting a long, grinding conflict with no clear end in sight. The moment Elena arrived, she was pulled into work, tending to a young soldier with a deep gash along his side, then a fevered scout who had been out in the rain too long, then a broken arm that needed setting before the bone could heal wrong. It was in the middle of this work, hours into her first day at the camp, that she first saw him. He was sitting near the edge of the medical tent, having refused a cot in favor of a simple wooden stool, watching the healers work with quiet attentiveness, rather than the impatience most soldiers showed while waiting to be treated. He was tall, with dark hair that fell loosely across his forehead, and a stillness about him that made him seem separate from the noise and motion around him, as though he existed just slightly outside of it. "You're bleeding," Elena said, noticing the dark stains spreading along his sleeve as she approached. "It can wait," he said. "Others need you more." She raised an eyebrow. "I am the one who decides who needs me more. Sit still." Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close to one. He held out his arm without further protest, and she began to clean the wound, a shallow but ugly cut that ran along his forearm. "You're not one of the border soldiers," she said, more observation than question, as she worked. "I know most of their faces by now." "I am not," he agreed, offering nothing further. "Then who are you?" He looked at her directly then, and there was something careful in the way he studied her, as though weighing how much truth to offer a stranger. "My name is Cale," he said finally. "I travel where I am needed. Right now, that is here." She did not press further, sensing that he would not answer even if she did, and instead finished wrapping the wound in clean linen. "Keep it dry," she instructed, "and do not use that arm for heavy lifting, for at least a week, though I suspect you will ignore that advice entirely." "You suspect correctly," he said, and this time, the almost smile became a real one, brief but genuine. She found herself, unexpectedly, smiling back, before she caught herself, and turned to the next patient waiting nearby. She did not think of the exchange again for the rest of that long day, too consumed with the steady flow of wounds and fevers that needed her attention, until well past dark. But she noticed, 3 days later, that Cale had not left the camp, though his wound had healed enough that he no longer needed daily treatment. He remained near the edges of things, speaking little, watching much, and somehow always present whenever Elena stepped outside the medical tent for a moment of air. "You're still here," she said one evening, finding him seated by a low fire at the camp's edge, away from the noise of the soldiers' quarters. "I find the company tolerable," he said, and gestured to the space beside him. Sit, if you like. You have been on your feet since before sunrise. She hesitated only a moment before accepting, grateful for the chance to rest her aching legs. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire, and she found the quiet between them oddly comfortable, unlike the careful, performative silences she had grown used to at court. Why do you stay here? She asked eventually. You have no wound left to tend, and you are not a soldier under this camp's command. Cale considered the question for a long moment before answering. I have few places that feel like they want me there, he said. This one, strangely, does not ask me to be anything other than what I am. Elena studied him in the firelight, and for reasons she could not entirely name, she believed him completely. There was no performance in the way he spoke, no careful measuring of words for effect, the way she had grown used to hearing from men who held power and knew how to wield it. He simply spoke, plainly, and let the truth of it stand on its own. I know something of what that feels like, she said quietly, wanting to belong somewhere, and not quite managing it. You seem to belong here well enough, Cale said, nodding toward the medical tent behind them. Every soldier in this camp speaks your name with something close to reverence. That is not the same as belonging, Elena said, surprising herself with the honesty of the admission. That is simply being useful. Cale turned to look at her fully then, his dark eyes steady and unhurried. Those are not the same thing, he agreed, and anyone who cannot tell the difference does not deserve to have you at all. The words landed somewhere deep in her chest, quiet but undeniable, like a stone dropped into still water. She did not know if he had meant them as pointedly as they felt, but she carried them with her back to her tent that night, turning them over and over until sleep finally found her. The days that followed settled into an unspoken rhythm. Elena worked through the mornings and afternoons tending to the camp's wounded, and in the evenings, more often than not, she found herself seated beside Cale near the low fire at the camp's edge, talking about small things, the shape of the hills, the taste of the poorly seasoned camp food, the strange quiet of a world that had known too much fighting for too long. He never asked about her life at the castle, and she never offered it, though she suspected, from the careful way he sometimes studied her, that he understood there was a wound there he had not yet been shown. She found she did not mind his patience. It felt, in its own quiet way, like a kind of respect she had rarely been given. Grace noticed the change in her, of course. Grace noticed everything. You are smiling again, the older healer observed one morning as they prepared bandages together. I had begun to worry I would never see it. It is only the fresh air, Elena said, though she knew Grace would not believe her. And indeed, the older woman only raised an eyebrow and said nothing more, though her expression carried a knowing warmth that made Elena's cheeks flush slightly. 2 weeks passed more quickly than Elena had expected, filled with long days of work and quiet evenings that had begun, without her quite realizing it, to feel like something she looked forward to, rather than simply endured. On the final night before the healers were to return to the castle, she found Cale waiting for her by the fire as usual, though his expression carried something more serious than the easy calm she had grown used to. You are leaving tomorrow, he said, not quite a question. I am, she confirmed. My work here is finished, for now. He nodded slowly, staring into the fire for a long moment before speaking again. I have enjoyed these 2 weeks more than I expected to, he said. More, I think, than I have enjoyed anything in a long while. As have I, Elena admitted, and found that she meant it entirely. Will you return? He asked. If the camp needs healers again? I do not know, she said honestly. That will not be my decision to make. Something passed across his face then, quick and unreadable, gone before she could name it. Then I hope, whatever happens, that it is your decision that matters most, he said quietly, not someone else's judgment of your worth. She looked at him then, really looked, and felt something stir in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time, not since the earliest days of her foolish devotion to a king who had never truly seen her. This felt different. This felt like being seen for the first time. Thank you, she said softly, for treating me like I matter, when I needed that more than I realized. You have always mattered, Cale said simply. Anyone who told you otherwise was simply too blind to see it. She rode back toward the castle the next morning, with those words settled quietly in her chest. and for the first time since the night in the Great Hall, she found she was not thinking of Damien Blackthorne at all. She was thinking only of dark eyes by a low fire, and a voice that had asked nothing of her except to be exactly who she was. She did not yet know that the man she had left behind at the border camp carried a truth about his own past that would soon unravel everything she believed about loyalty, kingdoms, and the price of pride. She did not yet know that the words spoken so carelessly in the Great Hall would echo back, in time, with consequences far greater than a moment of quiet heartbreak. She knew only that, for the first time in 3 long years, she felt something close to hope, and she rode toward home, with her chin lifted, no longer the girl who had slipped silently from a room, where her worth had been dismissed, in front of an entire court. Something had changed. She could feel it, quiet and certain, like the first warmth of spring after a long winter, and far behind her, at a border camp built along a restless river, a man with dark eyes and a hidden past watched her ride away, already certain that their paths were far from finished crossing. The castle looked exactly as she had left it, gray stone rising against a pale sky, banners hanging still in the windless afternoon. Yet Elena felt like a different person walking through its gates than the one who had ridden away 2 weeks earlier. She handed her horse to a stable hand, thanked him quietly, and made her way toward the healer's wing, already planning to report to Grace before resting. She did not expect to see Damien standing near the courtyard steps, speaking with 2 of his guards, his attention shifting toward her the moment she came into view. For a brief second, something in his expression softened, and he took a step in her direction, as though to greet her properly, the way he might have done before the night in the Great Hall. She met his gaze evenly, gave a small formal nod, the same courtesy she would have shown any noble she passed, and continued walking, without slowing her pace. She heard him call her name once, but she did not turn back, and after a moment, she heard no further attempt to stop her. It was a small thing, that single act of walking past him without pausing, but it felt, to her, like the first true step toward reclaiming something she had not realized she had lost. That evening, Grace found her sitting quietly in the healer's garden, staring at nothing in particular. "You seem different," Grace observed, settling onto the bench beside her. "Lighter somehow, though I suspect there is more weighing on you than you are saying." "The border camp was good for me," Elena admitted. "I did not expect it to be." "Was it the work?" Grace asked, a knowing edge to her voice. "Or was it something else entirely?" Elena allowed herself a small smile, the first genuine one she had shown since returning. "Perhaps a little of both," she said. Grace studied her for a long moment, then patted her hand gently. "Whatever it was, child, hold on to it. You have spent 3 years pouring yourself into a well that gave nothing back. It is long past time something poured itself into you instead." Elena did not answer, but she carried those words with her as she prepared for bed that night, alongside the memory of dark eyes by a low fire, and a voice that had called her by her true worth rather than her usefulness. She did not know, as she drifted toward sleep, that word of a mysterious stranger asking after her by name had already begun to reach the castle through the mouths of returning soldiers, or that Damien Blackthorne, alone in his private study long after midnight, had heard enough of those whispers to feel a restlessness he could not name and did not wish to examine too closely. For now, she slept peacefully, unaware that the quiet hope blooming in her chest was about to be tested by forces far larger than a careless remark spoken in a crowded hall, forces that would soon draw 2 kingdoms, 2 proud men, and 1 healer, who had finally learned her own worth, into a collision none of them could have predicted. The report reached Damien 3 days after Elena's return, delivered by a soldier who had no idea of its weight. "There was a man at Thornridge Camp," the soldier said, standing at attention before the throne, "who asked after the healer by name more than once during her stay. Kept close to the medical tent the whole time she was there. Some of the others joked that he seemed rather taken with her." Damien kept his expression carefully neutral, the way he had trained himself to do since childhood, the way every Alpha King learned to do before he learned much else. "Did this man give a name?" "KL, my lord. No family name given. He was not part of any registered unit, and none of the officers recognized him, though he fought well enough when the skirmish broke out along the ridge 2 days before the healers left." Damien dismissed the soldier with a wave of his hand and sat alone in the throne room, long after the great doors had closed. turning the name over in his mind. Cale. It meant nothing to him. It should have meant nothing to him. And yet he found himself unable to release the thought, the way a splinter refuses to be ignored no matter how small it is. He told himself it was simple concern, the natural caution of a king toward an unregistered stranger wandering near his borders. He told himself this several times, in fact, as though repetition might make it true. He did not examine too closely why the thought of a stranger asking after Elena by name left a hard, unfamiliar knot lodged just beneath his ribs. He saw her the following morning, crossing the courtyard with a basket of herbs balanced against her hip, moving with the same quiet efficiency she always carried. He found himself watching her longer than he intended, noting the way she no longer glanced toward him the way she once had, no longer lingered near enough to be noticed. She had always been there, at the edges of his days, a steady and familiar presence he had never once thought to question. Now, for the first time, he felt the absence of her attention like a draft through an open window. He told himself this, too, meant nothing. That evening, his beta, a broad-shouldered man named Torin who had served at Damien's side since they were boys, found him standing at the window of his study, staring out at nothing in particular. "You have been distracted for 3 days," Torin said, not bothering with formality, the privilege of long friendship. "Council members have noticed. One of them asked me this morning if the border conflict was troubling you more than you have let on." "It is not the border conflict," Damien admitted, though he had not intended to say anything at all. Torin raised an eyebrow and crossed the room to pour himself a cup of wine, settling into the chair across from Damien's desk with the easy familiarity of a man who had earned the right to speak freely. "Then what is it?" Damien hesitated, and in that hesitation, Torin's expression shifted into something knowing, something faintly amused. "This would not have anything to do with a certain healer, would it?" Torin said. "The one who no longer looks at you the way she used to. I noticed that myself, though I confess I did not expect you to notice it as well, given how thoroughly you insisted, quite publicly, that she means nothing to you." Damien's jaw tightened. "I never asked for your commentary." "No," Torin agreed easily, "but you have it regardless, because I have watched you make a great many decisions in the years I have served you, and this is the first one I have seen you regret before you even finished making it. I was standing in that hall, Damien. I saw her face before she set the tray down and walked out. You did not." "It was a simple statement," Damien said, though even to his own ears the words sounded hollow now. "She is a healer. Her position in this pack does not extend beyond that." "And yet here you are," Torin said, gesturing loosely toward the window, toward the empty courtyard beyond it, "standing alone in your study at midnight, distracted for 3 days straight, because a stranger at a border camp thought enough of her to ask after her name. If she truly means nothing to you, that fact should not cost you a single hour of sleep." Damien said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that would not confirm the very thing he had spent 3 years refusing to admit, even to himself, buried beneath the careful armor of duty and pride that every Alpha King learned to wear before he learned much else of value. Torin finished his wine and rose to leave, pausing at the door. "For what it is worth," he said, "I have known you since we were boys, chasing each other through the training yards, and I have never once seen you handle anything as poorly as you have handled this. You should fix it, before someone else decides to fix it for you." The door closed behind him, and Damien remained alone with his thoughts long into the night, though he found no answers waiting for him there, only the growing and uncomfortable certainty that Torin was right, and that the careless words spoken in a crowded hall had cost him something he was only now beginning to understand the value of. Meanwhile, at the border camp 2 days' ride away, Cale sat by the low fire that had, for 2 weeks, become something like a ritual, though it felt strange now to sit there alone. He had not expected to feel her absence so sharply, had not expected the quiet evenings by the fire to feel hollow, without her steady presence beside him. He had told himself, when he first arrived at Thornridge weeks earlier, that his purpose there was singular and clear, a quiet mission of observation tied to old grievances he had carried for years, grievances involving a council that had once betrayed his family and stripped him of a title he had been born to hold. He had not expected to find, in the middle of that grim purpose, a healer with tired eyes and careful hands who treated him not as a stranger to be watched, but simply as a person worth knowing. A young soldier named Owen approached the fire and settled onto a nearby log, nodding a greeting. "You've been quiet since the healers left," Owen observed, "especially compared to before. The camp feels different without them," Cale said simply. Owen chuckled. "Different, or quieter, or missing a certain someone in particular. I saw the way you watched for her every evening." Half the camp took notice, truth be told. Cale did not deny it, though he offered no further confirmation either. "She is easy to notice," he said instead. "Kind, in a place that rarely rewards kindness. That is rare enough to be worth watching for." "Word is she serves the Blackthorn court directly," Owen said, his tone shifting slightly, more careful now. "Healer to the Alpha King himself, some say, though there are also whispers that things are not entirely well between them. A public dismissal in front of the whole court, from what I have heard." Cale's expression hardened slightly at that, though he kept his voice even. "What sort of dismissal?" Owen shrugged. "Only rumors, mind you. The kind that travel faster than truth ever does. Something about the Alpha King telling a visiting lord she meant nothing to him, right in front of the entire hall. If it is true, I imagine that would sting rather badly, coming from a man she has served faithfully for years." Cale said nothing for a long moment, staring into the fire, something cold and quiet settling behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the chill of the evening air. He thought of Elena's careful hands, her steady voice, the quiet dignity with which she had carried herself despite whatever weight she had clearly been carrying beneath the surface. He thought of a king who had apparently looked at all of that and found it worth nothing at all. "Some men," Cale said finally, "are given everything, and understand the value of none of it." Owen glanced at him sideways, sensing something shift in the air between them, though he did not press further, simply nodding and turning his attention back to the fire. The two sat in silence for a while longer, before Owen excused himself, leaving Cale alone, with thoughts that had grown considerably more complicated than the simple mission that had first brought him to Thornridge. He had not planned to feel anything at all toward the healer who had stitched his wound on his first day at the camp. He had certainly not planned to feel the sharp, protective anger now settling in his chest at the thought of her being dismissed so carelessly by a man who apparently held power enough to shape entire kingdoms, but not enough sense to recognize what he had been given. Cale rose from the fire and walked toward the edge of the camp, looking out over the dark hills toward the direction Elena's party had ridden 2 days earlier. He did not know, in that moment, precisely what he intended to do with the feeling growing steadily in his chest, but he understood, with quiet and unshakable certainty, that this would not be the last time their paths crossed. Some debts, he thought, are owed not to kingdoms or titles, but to people who have been made to feel they are worth less than they are. And Cale Ashworth, exiled heir of a fallen pack, had spent enough of his own life being told he was worth nothing to recognize that particular wound the moment he saw it in someone else's eyes. Back at the castle, Elena knew nothing of the conversation taking place at the border camp, nor of the restless nights her own king had begun spending alone in his study. She spent her days tending to the usual rhythm of castle life, checking on patients in the healer's wing, gathering herbs in the early morning quiet, and slowly, carefully, rebuilding the parts of herself that 3 years of quiet devotion had worn thin. She found, to her own surprise, that she thought of Cale often, not with the desperate longing she had once carried for Damien, but with a warm and steady curiosity, wondering what he was doing at that border camp, whether he had found the mission he had never quite explained, whether their paths might cross again someday. She did not yet know how soon that day would come, or how completely it would change the course of everything she believed her life was meant to be. That night, as she prepared for sleep, a messenger arrived at the healer's wing, carrying urgent news from the border. The skirmishes along Thornridge had escalated. Additional healers were needed immediately, and Elena's name had been specifically requested, not by the camp's commanding officer, but by a soldier claiming to speak on behalf of a wounded stranger who refused treatment from anyone else. Elena stared at the message for a long moment, her heart beating a little faster than the news alone should have caused, before she began packing her things once more, already certain of what, or rather who, awaited her return to Thornridge. She found Grace in the healer's hall, preparing supplies for the same journey, having received similar orders only minutes earlier. "Escalated skirmishes," Grace said, shaking her head as she packed bandages into a leather satchel. "The Ashworth remnants have grown bolder these past weeks. Strange, considering how thoroughly that pack was broken years ago." Broken by whom? Elena asked, curious despite herself. By their own council, from what I understand, Grace said. A messy business, long before either of us served here. The heir was exiled, the pack scattered, and the territory absorbed quietly into neighboring lands, Blackthorn included, if the old records are to be believed. Elena filed the information away without much thought, more concerned with the practical matters of the journey ahead than with old pack politics that predated her service by many years. She finished packing quickly and met Grace and two other healers in the courtyard, just as the sun began to rise over the eastern wall. What she did not expect was to find Damien himself standing near the stables, dressed for travel, speaking quietly with Torin and a small contingent of guards. "You are coming to Thornridge," Elena said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "The escalation warrants my presence," Damien said, his tone carefully formal, though something in his eyes suggested the decision had not been made purely for strategic reasons. "I will be traveling with the healers' party for additional protection along the road." Elena said nothing, though she felt Grace's eyes flick toward her with poorly concealed curiosity. She mounted her horse and fell into position near the rear of the traveling party, keeping her distance from the king who rode near the front, his posture stiff and formal in a way that seemed, to her careful observation, entirely unlike him. Torin, riding beside Damien, glanced back once toward the rear of the column, caught Elena's eye briefly, and offered her a small, knowing smile before turning his attention forward again. Elena did not know what to make of it, though she suspected, correctly, that the beta understood far more about his king's recent restlessness than he was letting on. The journey to Thornridge stretched across 2 long days, and Elena spent most of it lost in her own thoughts, half dreading and half anticipating what awaited her at the camp. She thought of Cale's steady voice, the warmth of the low fire, the strange and unfamiliar comfort of being seen clearly by someone who asked nothing of her except honesty in return. She thought, too, though she tried not to, of the man riding at the front of the column, whose presence now felt like a formal stranger's, rather than the familiar weight it had once been. By the time the camp came into view on the horizon, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the western hills, Elena felt something tighten in her chest, a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty she had not felt in a very long time. She did not yet know that the days ahead would bring not only the wounded soldiers she had come to treat, but a reckoning between 2 men who had never once crossed paths, and a truth about one of them that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom she called home. She urged her horse forward, keeping pace with the rest of the column, and rode toward whatever waited for her at the border, unaware of just how much closer that reckoning had already become. The camp at Thornridge had changed since Elena's last visit, the atmosphere sharper, more urgent, tents set closer together, and guards posted at every visible ridgeline. She dismounted quickly, and was pulled almost immediately into the medical tent, where the wounded from the previous day's skirmish lay waiting in rows, some quiet, some groaning, all needing attention that could not wait for pleasantries or reunions. She worked for hours without pause, cleaning wounds, setting bones, brewing fever remedies over a small fire just outside the tent's entrance. It was well past midnight before the flow of urgent cases finally slowed enough for her to catch her breath, and it was only then, wiping her hands on a clean cloth, that she allowed herself to look up and search the camp for a familiar face. She found him near the edge of the firelight, exactly where she had known, somewhere in her chest, that he would be. Cale rose the moment he saw her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply taking in the sight of each other after 2 weeks of separation that had felt, to both of them, considerably longer than the calendar suggested. "You came," he said finally. "I was requested," she said, though the corner of her mouth lifted slightly, "by a wounded stranger, who refused treatment from anyone else, or so the message claimed. I may have exaggerated the wound slightly," Cale admitted, to ensure the message reached the right ears. "That is a dangerous game to play with the Healers Guild," Elena said, though there was no real reproach in her voice. "We take false claims of injury quite seriously." "Then perhaps you should examine me thoroughly," Cale said, "to be certain I am telling the truth." She laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and the sound of it seemed to loosen something in his shoulders that had been tense since the moment Owen had told him about the humiliation she had suffered weeks earlier. They walked together toward the low fire at the camp's edge, and for a while, neither spoke of anything beyond the small, ordinary details of the days that had passed between them. The strange comfort of simply being in each other's company again, after an absence neither had fully admitted to feeling. It was Cale who eventually broke the easier silence between them, his tone growing more careful. "I heard something, while you were away," he said, "about what happened in the Great Hall, before you first came to this camp." Elena's expression shifted, the warmth cooling slightly, though she did not look away from him. "Word travels quickly, it seems." "It does," Cale agreed. "I am sorry you were made to feel that way, by someone who should have known better than to say such a thing at all, let alone in front of an entire court." Elena was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "It was not entirely unexpected," she admitted finally. "I had simply chosen, for a long time, not to see what was plainly in front of me. He never made promises. I only allowed myself to imagine that his actions meant more than they did." "That does not make it right," Cale said, his voice quiet but firm. "Whatever he failed to promise you, he owed you decency regardless. Everyone deserves that much, at the very least." Elena looked at him then, something warm and grateful blooming behind her eyes. "You say that as though it is a simple truth," she said, "and yet I have known very few people who actually live by it." "Then perhaps you have simply been surrounded by the wrong people," Cale said. "That is not the same as the truth itself being rare." They sat together for a long while after that, the conversation drifting into easier territory, though something had shifted between them, an unspoken understanding settling into place that neither felt the need to name aloud just yet. When Elena finally rose to return to her tent, exhaustion from the long day of travel and treatment finally catching up with her, Cale walked her part way, the two of them moving slowly through the quiet camp under a sky thick with stars. "Rest well," he said, stopping at the edge of the healer's section. "Tomorrow will bring more of the same, I suspect." "It usually does," she agreed, though she found herself reluctant to say goodnight, lingering a moment longer than necessary. "Elena," he said, and something in the way he spoke her name, careful and deliberate, made her chest tighten pleasantly. "I know we have known each other only a short while, but I find myself thinking of you far more than a short acquaintance should account for." She held his gaze steadily. "I have found the same to be true," she admitted, "more than I expected to, and more than I entirely know what to do with." He smiled then, a real and full smile that transformed his usually careful expression into something younger, lighter. "Then perhaps," he said, "we simply allow ourselves the time to find out what to do with it, without rushing toward any conclusion neither of us is ready for." "I would like that," Elena said softly, and left him there at the edge of the firelight, retreating to her tent with a lightness in her chest she had not felt in a very long time. What neither of them knew, in that quiet and hopeful moment, was that Damien had arrived at the camp only hours earlier, and had witnessed the entire exchange from a distance, standing near the command tent with Torin at his side, watching the healer he had once dismissed so carelessly laugh freely with a stranger, whose name he had only recently learned to associate with unwelcome jealousy. "That is him, then," Damien said quietly, his voice carefully controlled despite the tightness visible in his jaw. "The one asking after her at the border." "That is him," Torin confirmed, watching his king's expression carefully. "Cale, they call him. No pack affiliation on record, though he fights well and keeps mostly to himself. Elena seems to trust him." "She barely knows him," Damien said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "She has known him longer than you have known, to care whether she trusts anyone at all," Torin said, not unkindly, though the observation landed with its own quiet weight. "You cannot begrudge her finding comfort somewhere, Damien, when you spent 3 years offering her none." Damien said nothing, his eyes still fixed on the two figures now parting ways near the healer's tents, Elena disappearing into her quarters, while Cale lingered a moment longer, watching her go with an expression Damien recognized uncomfortably well, because he had spent the last several weeks wearing something close to it himself, without fully understanding what it meant. "I want to know more about him," Damien said finally, "where he comes from, what business he has lingering at this camp for weeks without formal assignment." "I can make inquiries," Torin said, "though I suspect, Damien, that whatever you learn will not change the fact that she looked happier, in that single exchange, than I have seen her look in years, serving under your roof." Damien did not respond, turning instead toward the command tent, though the image of Elena's unguarded laughter stayed with him long into the sleepless night that followed, mixing uncomfortably with the growing, unwelcome certainty that Torin's inquiries, whatever they uncovered, would only confirm what he had already begun to suspect. He had thrown away something valuable without ever understanding its worth, and now, watching another man discover that worth so easily, he found himself facing a hollow, gnawing regret unlike anything he had experienced before. The following days at Thornridge passed in a blur of urgent work for Elena, the skirmishes along the border showing no signs of slowing, wounded soldiers arriving in steady waves that kept every healer in camp occupied from dawn until well past dark. She saw little of Cale during the daylight hours, both of them consumed by their separate duties, though their evenings by the fire became a steady and welcome ritual, the one part of each long day she found herself looking forward to with quiet anticipation. She saw even less of Damien, who kept largely to the command tent, consulting with officers and reviewing reports of the ongoing conflict. When their paths did cross, briefly, in the mess tent or along the camp's central path, the exchanges between them remained stiffly formal, neither quite able to find the words to bridge whatever distance now stretched between them, a distance that had grown far wider than either had anticipated when the journey began. It was on the fifth evening at the camp that everything began to change, when a scouting party returned with urgent news that sent the entire camp into a flurry of tense activity. A larger force, bearing the old, faded colors of the Ashworth Pack, had been spotted moving through the contested territory to the north, far more organized and better armed than the scattered remnants the Blackthorn forces had grown accustomed to skirmishing with over the previous months. Damien called an immediate council in the command tent, and Elena, passing nearby on her way to check on a fevered patient, caught fragments of the tense discussion through the canvas walls, words like coordinated and unexpected and possible uprising drifting out into the cooling evening air. She did not think much of it in the moment, too consumed with her own duties to dwell on matters of strategy and war that fell far outside her responsibilities as a healer. She did not yet know that the man she had come to care for so quickly, so unexpectedly, carried a connection to that very pack, whose resurgence now threatened to upend the fragile peace along the border. A connection that would soon force him to reveal a truth about himself that he had carefully guarded for years, and that would, in time, reshape everything Elena believed about loyalty, exile, and the price of a stolen birthright. For now, she simply finished her rounds and made her way toward the low fire at the camp's edge, hoping to find a few quiet moments with Cale before exhaustion finally claimed her for the night, unaware that the ground beneath the fragile peace of their evenings together had already begun, quietly and irreversibly, to shift. She found him standing rather than sitting, staring north toward the dark hills where the scouting party had spotted the advancing force. His usual calm had given way to something tighter, more focused, and when he turned to greet her, it took him a moment longer than usual to soften his expression into the warmth she had grown used to seeing there. "You heard the news," she said, settling onto the log beside the fire. "Some of it," he said carefully. "Enough to know the camp will be busy again soon. Do you know anything of the Ashworth Pack?" She asked, curious more than suspicious, the name simply another piece of old history she had absorbed secondhand from Grace's brief explanation days earlier. Grace mentioned them once, said they were broken years ago, their territory absorbed by neighboring lands. Something flickered across Cale's face, quick and difficult to read in the uneven firelight, gone before she could name it clearly. "I know a little," he said, his voice carefully even. "It was a messy affair, from what I understand. Betrayal within their own ranks, long before the wider conflict that scattered what remained of them." "That sounds like more than a little," Elena observed gently, noting the careful distance in his tone, the way he seemed to be choosing each word with unusual precision. "Perhaps," he admitted, meeting her eyes briefly, before looking back toward the fire. "There are things about my past I have not yet shared with you, Elena. Not because I do not trust you, but because the truth of it is complicated, and I did not want it to shape how you saw me, before you had the chance to know me, simply as myself." She studied him for a long moment, weighing the careful honesty of his admission against the curiosity it stirred in her. "I have no wish to press you before you are ready," she said finally. "I have learned, this past year, how much weight a person can carry quietly, and how little good it does to have that weight forced into the light before it's time. Whatever it is, I trust that you will tell me when you are ready, and not before." Relief passed visibly across his features, and he reached out, hesitantly, to take her hand in his, the first time he had done so since they had met weeks earlier. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That is more grace than I expected, and more than I likely deserve." "Everyone deserves a little grace," she said, echoing, without quite realizing it, the very words he had once offered her. "Especially those who have shown it so readily to others." They sat together for a long while after that, her hands still resting comfortably in his, watching the fire burn low, as the camp settled into its uneasy nighttime quiet around them. Neither spoke further of the Ashworth pack, or the advancing force to the north, content, for a little while longer, to simply exist together in the fragile peace of the present moment, before whatever storm was building on the horizon finally broke. Torrin, who found Damien, still awake, near the command tent, long after most of the camp had gone quiet, staring out toward the same low fire, where Elena and Cale sat together, their hands clasped, heads bent close in quiet conversation. "You should sleep," Torrin said, though he made no move to leave himself, settling instead beside his king, with the ease of long friendship. "Tomorrow will bring difficult decisions, and you will need a clear mind for them." "I keep thinking," Damien said slowly, "about the day I found her in the forest, 16 years old, and terrified, bleeding from a rogue wolf's claws. I carried her back to the castle myself. I did not trust anyone else to do it." "I remember," Torrin said. "You were insufferable about it for weeks afterward, if I recall correctly, telling anyone who would listen how you had saved her life." A faint, humorless smile touched Damien's mouth. "I suppose I thought that meant something, that some bond had formed in that moment, one that did not need to be spoken aloud to be real." "Bonds require tending, Damien," Torrin said gently, "even the ones formed in dramatic circumstances. You cannot save someone's life once and expect that single act to sustain a connection for years afterward, especially when you spend those years treating the person as though she were furniture, rather than a person with her own heart, her own hopes, her own need to be seen and valued for who she is." Damien was quiet for a long moment, watching the distant fire, where Elena's laughter occasionally drifted faintly across the camp, carried on the cool night air. "I did not understand," he said finally, "how much I valued her, until I watched someone else recognize it so easily, in a matter of weeks, what I failed to recognize in 3 years." "That is often how these things go," Torrin said, not unkindly. "We rarely understand the value of water until the well runs dry. The question now, Damien, is what you intend to do with that understanding, now that you finally have it. Because from where I am standing, it may already be too late to undo the damage of that single careless evening in the Great Hall." Damien did not answer, his jaw tight, his eyes still fixed on the distant fire, and the two figures seated beside it, their contentment visible even from a distance, a contentment he realized, with a hollow and unfamiliar ache, he had never once managed to give her himself. He rose finally and retreated to his own tent, though sleep did not come easily that night, his thoughts circling endlessly between old memories of a frightened 16-year-old girl in a forest clearing, and the image of her laughing freely beside a stranger's fire, a stranger whose very presence at this border camp, Damien was beginning to suspect, might carry far more significance than a simple wandering soldier's chance arrival. The next morning brought fresh reports from the scouting parties, confirming that the advancing force bearing the Ashworth colors numbered in the hundreds, far larger and better organized than any remnant force the Blackthorn soldiers had encountered in recent memory. Whispers began spreading through the camp of a hidden leader, rallying the scattered survivors of the fallen pack, someone with enough authority and charisma to unite what had, for years, been considered permanently broken. Elena heard these whispers while tending to a young soldier's fever, and found herself, for reasons she could not entirely explain, thinking immediately of Cale's careful, guarded expression from the previous evening, and the words he had spoken about a past too complicated to share before its time. She told herself the two things could not possibly be connected. She told herself this several times throughout the long day of work that followed, though the thought lingered stubbornly at the edges of her mind regardless, refusing to be fully dismissed. That evening, she found the low fire at the camp's edge empty for the first time since her return, Cale nowhere to be found among the usual gathering of soldiers settling in for the night. A quiet unease settled over her as she searched the camp briefly, checking the training grounds, the mess tent, the perimeter watch posts, finding no trace of him anywhere within the boundaries of the Blackthorn encampment. It was Owen, finally, who found her searching, and offered a piece of information that deepened her unease considerably. He left an hour before sunset, Owen said, his expression carefully neutral. Rode out toward the northern hills alone, without explanation. Told no one where he was going or when he intended to return. Elena stood very still, staring out toward the dark northern hills where, according to the day's reports, hundreds of Ashworth soldiers were gathering under the banner of a leader whose identity remained, as of yet, entirely unknown to the Blackthorn command. She did not yet have proof of anything. She told herself, standing alone at the edge of the quiet camp, that there could be a dozen innocent explanations for Cale's sudden departure. But the cold unease settling in her chest refused to be reasoned away entirely, and she found herself watching the northern horizon long into the night, waiting for a return that did not come, before exhaustion finally forced her to retreat to her own tent, carrying with her a growing certainty that the truth Cale had promised to share, when he was ready, might arrive far sooner and far more dramatically than either of them had anticipated. Cale returned to the camp just before dawn, slipping quietly past the perimeter guards with the practiced ease of someone who had once known these hills far better than any Blackthorn soldier currently stationed along them. He found Elena waiting for him near the healers' tents, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the early morning chill, her expression a careful mixture of relief and unmistakable concern. "You were gone all night," she said, not bothering to disguise the worry in her voice. "Owen said you rode out alone, toward the northern hills, without telling anyone where you were going." Cale's expression shifted, weighing something internally, before he finally spoke. "I needed to see something for myself," he said. "Confirm a suspicion before I brought it to anyone else." "And did you confirm it?" Elena asked, though something in his careful stillness told her she already knew, at least in part, what his answer would be. "I did," he said quietly. He glanced around the quiet camp, still mostly asleep in the pale early light, then gestured toward the low fire, now cold and dark from the night before. "Walk with me. There is something I need to tell you, and I would rather you hear it from me than from rumor or report." They walked together to the edge of the camp, beyond the reach of the perimeter guards' watchful eyes, and settled onto a fallen log overlooking the river that marked the uneasy border. Cale was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts, before he finally began to speak. "The force gathering in the northern hills is indeed made up of Ashworth remnants," he said. "But they are not simply scattered survivors rallying by chance. They are being led, organized, with real purpose, for the first time since the Pack's fall from power, years ago." "Led by whom?" Elena asked, though a quiet, growing suspicion had already begun forming in her chest, one she was not yet ready to name aloud. Cale met her eyes directly, and in that steady, unflinching gaze, she found her answer before he even spoke the words. "By me," he said simply. "I am not a wandering soldier with no Pack affiliation, Elena. I am Cale Ashworth, the exiled heir of the Pack that once held this very territory, before a betrayal within my own council stripped my family of everything we held, years before I ever set foot in this border camp." Elena sat very still, processing the weight of his admission, pieces of the past weeks rearranging themselves in her mind, with sudden and startling clarity. The careful way he had always avoided speaking of his past, the quiet, guarded intensity whenever the Ashworth Pack had come up in conversation, the unexplained departures, the fighting skill that seemed far beyond that of an ordinary wandering soldier. "You are the heir," she said slowly, "to a Pack currently massing an army along the very border I have been sent to treat wounded soldiers on behalf of." "Yes," Cale confirmed, no attempt at softening the truth, or making it more palatable than it was. "And you have known this about yourself the entire time we have known each other," she continued. "While I spoke to you of things that troubled me, while I let myself trust you, while I began to care for you, without knowing this single, enormous fact about who you truly are." "I know," he said, his voice carrying genuine regret. "I did not lie to you outright, Elena, but I withheld a great deal, and I understand if that withholding feels like its own kind of dishonesty. I did not tell you because I did not know, when we first met, whether I could trust you with something that could easily be used against me, and everyone loyal to my cause. And later, once I did trust you, I found myself afraid that the truth would change how you saw me, that you would look at me and see only a rebel leader plotting against the very kingdom you serve, rather than simply myself. Elena rose from the log and walked a few steps toward the river's edge, needing a moment to gather her own thoughts before responding. The morning air was cool against her face, and she stood there for a long while, watching the water move steadily past, carrying with it, she thought, some measure of the certainty she had felt just days earlier about the growing connection between them. "What is it you intend to do?" she asked finally, turning back to face him. "With this army you have gathered in the northern hills." Cale rose as well, closing some of the distance between them, though he stopped short of reaching for her, sensing, correctly, that she needed space to process what he had told her. "I intend to reclaim what was stolen from my family," he said, "not through senseless conflict, if it can be avoided, but through a formal challenge to the council members responsible for my exile, many of whom still hold positions of influence within the very court you serve. I have spent years gathering evidence of the betrayal that led to my family's fall, evidence that implicates individuals who have never faced any consequence for what they did." "And the army," Elena pressed. "What role does it serve in this plan?" "A necessary show of strength," Cale admitted. "Those who orchestrated my family's downfall will not simply step aside because I present evidence of their guilt. Power rarely surrenders itself willingly, no matter how clear the truth of wrongdoing may be. The army exists to ensure that when I make my claim, it cannot simply be dismissed or buried by those with the influence to do so." Elena considered this for a long moment, weighing the careful, measured way he had explained himself against the very real danger such a confrontation would pose, not only to Cale himself, but to the fragile peace of the entire border region, a peace that countless soldiers, on both sides, had already paid for with their own blood and suffering. "This puts me in an impossible position," she said finally. "I serve the Blackthorn court. I have sworn duties to the very kingdom your forces now threaten to confront, and yet I find that my feelings for you have not changed, despite everything you have just told me, which frightens me more than the truth about your identity ever could." Cale closed the remaining distance between them then, gently taking her hands in his. "I am not asking you to choose between your duties and whatever exists between us," he said quietly. "I only wanted you to know the truth, Elena, because you deserve that much, and because I could not bear the thought of you learning who I truly am, from a battlefield report, rather than from my own voice." "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Between us, I mean, now that I know all of this." "That," Cale said, "is entirely for you to decide. I will not ask you to abandon your loyalties, and I will not pretend that the path ahead of me is anything other than dangerous and uncertain. But I can tell you, with complete honesty, that what I feel for you has nothing to do with strategy or advantage. It grew entirely on its own, in quiet evenings by a fire, long before I ever considered how complicated it would eventually become." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of deception, and finding none, only the same steady, careful honesty that had first drawn her to him weeks earlier. "I need time," she said finally, "to think through what this means, for both of us, and for the kingdom I have sworn to serve." "Take whatever time you need," Cale said, releasing her hands with visible reluctance. "I am not going anywhere, not until this matter is resolved, one way or another." She nodded, and turned to walk back toward the camp, her thoughts a tangled mess of loyalty, affection, and the uncomfortable weight of a truth she had not asked for, but now had to carry regardless. She did not notice, as she made her way back through the waking camp, that Damien had risen early that morning as well, and had witnessed, from a discreet distance, the quiet and clearly emotional conversation between Elena and the stranger he had grown increasingly suspicious of over the previous days. Damien had not heard the words exchanged between them, the distance too great, and the wind carrying their voices away from where he stood near the command tent. But he had seen enough. The careful way Cale had taken her hands, the visible weight of whatever conversation had passed between them, to understand that something significant had shifted, something that went far beyond simple border camp friendship. He summoned Torin immediately, his expression grim. "I want everything you can find about the man calling himself Cale," he said. "Every rumor, every report, every scrap of information from anyone who has encountered him before he arrived at this camp. I want it by midday. You suspect something, Torrin observed, studying his king's tense expression. I suspect a great deal, Damien said, and none of it brings me any comfort. Find out who he truly is, Torrin, before this camp finds itself caught in the middle of something none of us saw coming. Torrin nodded and departed to begin his inquiries, leaving Damien alone once more with his thoughts, the image of Elena's hands clasped gently in a stranger's grip burning itself into his memory, alongside a growing uneasy certainty that whatever truth Torrin uncovered would arrive too late to prevent whatever storm was already gathering along the northern horizon. By midday, Torrin returned with information, gathered hastily from several older soldiers who had served during the years of the original Ashworth conflict, information that confirmed Damien's worst suspicions with startling clarity. The description matched. The fighting style matched. Even the faint, old scar along Cale's forearm, visible during his initial treatment weeks earlier, matched reports of a distinguishing mark carried by the exiled Ashworth heir since childhood. It is him, Torrin confirmed quietly. The exiled heir, presumed dead or scattered for years, has apparently been alive and gathering strength this entire time, right beneath our own border patrols. Damien absorbed this information with a stillness that worried Torrin more than any visible outburst would have. And he has been here, at this camp for weeks, Damien said slowly, close enough to Elena to earn her trust, to gain her affection, all while secretly rebuilding an army meant to challenge the very kingdom she serves. It would seem so, Torrin confirmed. Damien's jaw tightened, old instincts of duty and territorial protection warring uncomfortably with the newer, rawer feeling of watching someone he had only recently realized he cared for slip steadily further from his reach, toward a man whose very presence at this border now threatened to unravel the fragile peace the entire region depended upon. Assemble the council, Damien said finally, his voice carrying the cold authority of a king preparing for confrontation. It is time we address the Ashworth heir directly, before this situation grows any further beyond our control. Neither Damien nor Torrin yet knew just how deeply the coming confrontation would test not only the kingdom's fragile peace, but the personal reckoning quietly building within Damien himself, a reckoning that had begun weeks earlier, with 3 careless words spoken in a crowded hall, and that now threatened to cost him far more than he had ever imagined possible. The council gathered within the hour, a small group of senior officers and advisors crowded into the command tent, the mood tense as Damien laid out what Torrin had uncovered. Most of the older members remembered the Ashworth conflict well, having served during the years when the Pack's sudden and violent fall from power had reshaped the region's balance of authority. If the heir has truly survived and gathered a force this size, said an older advisor named Edmund Vance, his voice carrying the practiced calm of a man who had weathered many such councils before, then we must consider the possibility that his claims of betrayal carry some truth. It would explain a great deal about how quickly he has managed to rally support among the scattered remnants. Damien studied Edmund carefully as he spoke, something about the man's carefully measured tone striking him as slightly too rehearsed, though he could not immediately place why the observation unsettled him. He had known Edmund for years, a longtime council member who had served faithfully since before Damien's own coronation, and yet something in this particular moment felt subtly wrong. What would you suggest then? Damien asked, watching Edmund's expression closely. A show of strength, Edmund said without hesitation. Meet this rebellion decisively before it grows further, rather than entertaining any formal challenge or negotiation. Rebellions that are allowed to speak often gather more legitimacy than they deserve. Torrin, standing near the tent's entrance, exchanged a brief glance with Damien, both of them noting the unusual eagerness in Edmund's recommendation, a stark contrast to the older advisor's typically cautious approach to matters of conflict. We will not decide anything so significant without further information, Damien said finally, addressing the full council. I want confirmation of exactly what evidence this Ashworth heir believes he holds, and against whom, before we commit to any course of action that could needlessly escalate an already fragile situation. The council dispersed with murmured agreement, though Edmund lingered a moment longer than the others, his expression carefully neutral as he studied his king. A wise approach, as always, he said smoothly, before departing the tent. Once the tent had emptied, Torrin turned to Damien with a troubled expression. You noticed it too, he said. Edmund's eagerness for immediate confrontation, rather than his usual caution. "I noticed," Damien confirmed. "It may be nothing more than an old man's wariness of rebellion, but I want you to look further into Edmund's history, Torin, particularly his role during the original Ashworth conflict all those years ago. Something about this entire situation feels far less straightforward than it first appeared." Torin nodded and departed to begin his renewed inquiries, leaving Damien alone once more, his mind circling between the immediate danger gathering along the northern border and the quieter, more personal ache of watching Elena's trust shift so completely toward a man whose very identity had, until hours earlier, been a carefully guarded secret. He found himself, in a rare and uncomfortable moment of honesty, wondering whether his growing suspicion of Cale was rooted purely in matters of kingdom security, or whether some smaller, more selfish part of him simply could not bear watching Elena look at another man the way she had once, briefly and quietly, looked at him. He did not enjoy sitting with that question for long, and pushed it firmly aside in favor of the more immediate work of preparing his kingdom for whatever confrontation lay ahead. Elena, meanwhile, spent the remainder of that long day lost in quiet reflection, between her healing duties, turning Cale's confession over and over in her mind, weighing the danger of his claim against the steady honesty with which he had delivered it. She did not doubt that he believed his own cause was just. She had seen enough of his character over the past weeks to trust that his intentions, however dangerous their consequences, were rooted in genuine grievance rather than simple ambition. What she could not yet reconcile was her own position, caught between loyalty to a kingdom she had served faithfully for years and a growing, undeniable connection to a man whose very cause now threatened that same kingdom's stability. She found no easy answers by the time evening fell, only a deepening certainty that the days ahead would demand choices far more difficult than any she had faced before, choices that would test not only her loyalty, but her understanding of what loyalty itself was truly meant to protect. 3 days passed before Elena found the clarity she had been searching for. 3 days of careful thought carried out between the steady rhythm of her healing duties and the quiet, sleepless nights that followed. She had watched the camp grow steadily more tense, as reports continued arriving of the Ashworth forces massing along the northern hills, watched Damien retreat further into the careful, formal distance of a king preparing for possible conflict, and watched Cale himself grow more restrained in her presence, giving her the space she had asked for, without ever once pressing for an answer before she was ready to give one. On the third evening, she found him standing alone at the edge of the camp, staring north toward the hills where his gathered forces waited, his expression carrying a weight she had not seen on him before, the burden of a man preparing to reclaim something that had cost his family everything to lose. "I have made my decision," she said, approaching quietly. He turned to face her, his expression carefully guarded, bracing, she suspected, for whatever answer she had come to deliver. "Tell me," he said simply. "I cannot pretend that what you have told me does not complicate everything," Elena said. "My duties, my loyalties, the very ground I stand on here at this camp, but I have spent 3 years giving my devotion to someone who never once saw its true value, who dismissed me as easily as one might dismiss a servant carrying an unwanted tray. And in the weeks since I met you, you have never once made me feel that way. You have seen me, Cale, fully and honestly, in a way I did not know I was still capable of being seen." "Elena," he said softly, though he did not interrupt further, sensing she had more to say. "I do not know how this ends," she continued, "for you, for your cause, for the kingdom I have served, but I know that I do not wish to spend whatever time remains, before this conflict unfolds, pretending that what exists between us is not real, simply because it is complicated, or inconvenient, or dangerous. I choose you, Cale, whatever that means, whatever it costs." Something in his careful composure broke open at her words, relief and warmth flooding into an expression that had carried too much guarded weight for too many days. He closed the distance between them and took her face gently in his hands. "You do not know," he said quietly, "how much I hoped to hear those words, and how little I allowed myself to expect them. I did not expect to say them either," she admitted, "until I found myself standing here, certain of nothing except this." He kissed her then, gently at first, and she felt something settle deep within her chest, a rightness she had never once experienced in 3 years of quiet, unrequited devotion to another man. When they finally parted, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers, his voice carrying a new and quiet intensity. "There is something more I must ask of you," he said. "Something that would bind us together in a way that cannot be undone, not by distance, not by conflict, not by any force that might try to come between us." Elena understood immediately what he meant. The old and sacred practice known to every wolf born into pack tradition, the marking that formed a true and permanent bond between mates, recognized by every pack across every territory as an unbreakable connection. "You are asking me to be your mate," she said softly. "I am asking," he confirmed, "not commanding. I want you to understand fully what this means before you answer. A mate mark cannot be undone. It ties us together for the whole of our lives, through whatever comes, whatever conflict, whatever consequence. I would not ask this of you lightly, and I will accept whatever answer you give, even if that answer is not yet." She studied his face for a long moment in the moonlight, weighing the enormity of what he offered against the quiet, unshakable certainty that had settled in her chest the moment she chose to walk toward him, rather than away. She thought of 3 years given freely to someone who had never once asked what she wanted, who had simply assumed her devotion as his due, without ever considering the weight of it. Cale was asking. That distinction, more than anything else, told her everything she needed to know about the difference between them. "Yes," she said simply, steadily. "I choose this, Cale, entirely, and on my own terms." He kissed her again, slower this time, filled with a tenderness that left no doubt in her mind about the sincerity of his feelings, before guiding her gently to sit beside him, beneath the star-filled sky, away from the camp's watchful eyes, in a quiet clearing at the forest's edge that felt, in that moment, like the only place in the world that mattered. The marking itself was gentle, entirely unlike the violent imagery such bonds were sometimes rumored to carry, among those unfamiliar with pack tradition. Cale asked her, once more, whether she was certain, and only proceeded when she confirmed it with steady, unwavering certainty. The bond ignited between them with a warm, golden shimmer that seemed to hum beneath her skin, a sensation unlike anything she had ever experienced, an undeniable pull that settled deep into her bones and told her, with absolute clarity, that this connection was real, permanent, and entirely her own choice. When it was finished, she felt lighter somehow, as though some old and heavy weight she had carried for years, without realizing, it had finally been set down. Cale held her close beneath the stars, and for a while, neither of them spoke, simply existing together, in the quiet aftermath of a bond that would, they both understood, reshape everything that came next. "Whatever happens now," Cale said finally, his voice quiet against her hair, "whatever conflict unfolds between my forces and the Blackthorn Kingdom, know that this choice was entirely yours, and entirely real. No war, no title, no crown, will ever change what just happened between us." "I know," Elena said softly, and found that she believed it completely. They did not return to the main camp until well past midnight, and if any of the perimeter guards noticed their late return, none commented on it, though word of a mate bond formed between the healer and the mysterious stranger began, inevitably, to spread through the camp's quiet channels of rumor and gossip by the following morning, reaching, as such things always eventually did, the ears of the Blackthorn Command itself. Damien received the news from Torrin shortly after dawn, delivered with careful, measured words that did little to soften the weight of what they conveyed. "It is confirmed," Torrin said quietly. "Elena has accepted a mate mark from the Ashworth heir. The bond was formed last night, according to several soldiers who noticed the change in her scent this morning." Damien stood very still, absorbing the news with an expression that gave away almost nothing, though Torrin, who had known him since boyhood, recognized the careful, controlled stillness for exactly what it was, the fragile composure of a man holding back something far more volatile beneath the surface. "She is bonded to him now," Damien said slowly, as though testing the weight of the words aloud. "Permanently." "Yes," Torrin confirmed. Damien turned away, walking to the edge of the command tent and staring out toward the healer's section of camp, where Elena, unaware of the news that had already reached her king, was beginning her morning rounds, moving with a lightness in her step that Torrin, watching alongside Damien, recognized immediately as the unmistakable glow of a newly bonded mate. "I did this," Damien said quietly, more to himself than to Torin. 3 years of quiet devotion, and I threw it away with 3 careless words in front of an entire court. And now she belongs, permanently and completely, to a man leading an army against my own kingdom. You cannot undo what has already happened, Torin said carefully. The question now is what you intend to do moving forward, both regarding the Ashworth threat and regarding whatever remains of your own feelings toward her. Damien's jaw tightened, old instincts of pride and territorial authority beginning to war fiercely against the raw, unfamiliar grief settling in his chest. There are old pack laws, he said slowly, regarding the marking of a healer bound in service to a pack, laws requiring formal approval from the ruling alpha before such a bond can be recognized as legitimate within pack territory. Torin's expression sharpened with concern. Damien, those laws exist to prevent hostile pack members from claiming healers against their will during times of conflict, not to punish a healer who chose her own mate freely, out of genuine affection. Invoking such a law now, against a bond Elena clearly entered willingly, would be seen by everyone, including Elena herself, as nothing more than an act of wounded pride. Perhaps it is, Damien admitted, his voice carrying an edge Torin rarely heard from him. But that man is also leading an army against my kingdom, Torin. Whatever else he may be to Elena, he remains a threat to everything I am sworn to protect. I cannot simply set that aside because of a personal wound. And if you invoke that law, Torin pressed, what do you imagine that accomplishes, beyond confirming to Elena, and to your entire court, that you value your own pride over her happiness, exactly as you did the night you dismissed her in front of that visiting alpha? Damien did not answer immediately, the question landing with uncomfortable weight, though the storm already building within him, fueled equally by genuine concern for his kingdom's security, and a rawer, more personal grief he was not yet ready to fully acknowledge, refused to be so easily quieted by reason alone. Assemble the council, he said finally, his voice carrying the cold, formal authority of a king, rather than the uncertain grief of a man who had lost something he had only just begun to understand the value of. We will discuss the Ashworth threat, and we will discuss the matter of the healer's bond, together, before this situation grows any further beyond what any of us can control. Torin departed reluctantly to carry out the order, casting one final troubled glance back at his king, before leaving the tent, sensing, with a weight he could not quite shake, that whatever decision emerged from the coming council would set in motion consequences far graver than any of them yet fully understood, consequences that would test not only the fragile peace of the border region, but the very foundations of the kingdom Damien had spent his entire life building. Elena, finishing her morning rounds unaware of the storm gathering around her, felt only the quiet, steady warmth of the bond now settled permanently beneath her skin, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel happy, entirely and without reservation, unaware of just how quickly that happiness was about to be tested by forces far larger than herself. The council gathered within the hour, the same tense faces from days earlier crowding once more into the command tent, though the mood now carried an added weight, the news of Elena's bond having already spread through camp and reached every member present before the meeting even began. This changes matters considerably, Edmund Vance said, his tone carrying its usual careful calm, though something beneath it seemed, to Damien's increasingly wary ear, closer to satisfaction than concern. The healer's bond to the Ashworth heir cannot be allowed to stand unaddressed. Pack law is clear on this matter. Any bonding involving a healer bound in active service requires formal recognition from the ruling alpha, particularly during a period of active conflict with the very pack the mate in question represents. The law exists to prevent coercion, Damien said, echoing Torin's earlier argument despite the turmoil still churning beneath his own composed exterior. Not to punish a willing bond formed freely between two consenting adults. Willing or not, Edmund pressed, the law does not distinguish. And I would remind you, my lord, that failing to address this matter formally could be seen by the wider pack as weakness, particularly at a moment when the very man she has bonded with leads an armed force against our borders. Your authority cannot afford to appear uncertain, not now. Several other council members murmured agreement, and Damien felt the familiar, practiced weight of political pressure settling over him, the kind he had learned to navigate since boyhood, the kind that valued the appearance of strength over the quieter, harder work of doing what was actually right. He glanced toward Torin, who remained notably silent, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes carried a warning Damien understood clearly enough. "I will consider the matter," Damien said finally, alongside the more pressing question of how we intend to respond to the Ashworth forces gathering along our border. "I will not make a hasty decision regarding pack law simply because it is politically convenient to do so in this moment." Edmund inclined his head in careful deference, though something in his expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, suggested he had expected exactly this response, and had already planned accordingly. The council moved on to discuss military logistics, defensive positioning, and the possibility of formal negotiation with the Ashworth forces, though Damien found himself only half attending to the discussion, his thoughts circling back repeatedly to the growing unease he felt regarding Edmund's unusually persistent eagerness to see the bond formally punished. After the council dispersed, Torin lingered behind, waiting until the tent had emptied before speaking. "You saw it too," he said. Edmund's satisfaction, barely concealed, at the prospect of formally punishing this bond. "I saw it," Damien confirmed. "Have you found anything more regarding his history with the original Ashworth conflict?" "Not yet," Torin admitted. "But I have sent inquiries to the older record keepers back at the castle. Whatever role Edmund played all those years ago, if any, the answer will not remain hidden much longer." Damien nodded slowly, though his thoughts remained divided, torn between the growing suspicion surrounding Edmund's motives and the rawer, more personal grief still churning beneath his careful composure regarding Elena's bond. He walked alone to the edge of the camp that evening, staring north toward the hills where Cale's forces remained gathered, and found himself, for the first time in his life, uncertain of what path forward would actually serve his kingdom, rather than simply his own wounded pride. He thought of the frightened 16-year-old girl he had carried from a forest clearing years earlier, and of the woman she had become, steady and skilled and quietly devoted. Devotion he had accepted for years without ever once questioning its cost to her. He thought of the golden warmth Torin had described seeing in her expression that morning, a happiness he had never once managed to give her himself, despite every opportunity he had been afforded to do so. Whatever decision he made in the coming days, he understood, standing alone in the gathering dusk, that it would need to be made honestly, weighed against the true cost to Elena's happiness, rather than simply his own pride, or the political convenience Edmund seemed so eager to press upon him. He did not yet know whether he possessed the strength to make that harder, more honest choice, or whether old habits of pride and control would win out instead, as they so often had before. For now, he returned to the command tent, the weight of the coming days settling heavily across his shoulders, uncertain of anything, except the growing certainty that the choices ahead would test him more thoroughly than any battle he had yet faced in his years as Alpha King. 2 days after the council meeting, word arrived that shifted the balance of the entire situation once more. A rider from the Ashworth camp approached the Blackthorn perimeter under a flag of parley, carrying a formal request from Cale himself for a meeting between the two leaders, an offer to discuss terms before any further conflict escalated the situation beyond recovery. Damien agreed to the meeting, though he insisted it take place on neutral ground, a clearing along the riverbank, equidistant between the two camps, with only a small contingent of guards present on each side. Torin accompanied him, along with 2 senior officers, while Cale arrived with a similarly small escort, Elena notably absent from the gathering, a fact Damien noted with a complicated mixture of relief and disappointment he did not examine too closely. The 2 men stood facing each other across the clearing, the tension between them palpable despite the formal calm both maintained for the sake of the negotiation. "You requested this meeting," Damien said, his tone carefully even. "State your terms." Cale studied him for a long moment before speaking, his expression giving away little of whatever calculation lay behind it. "I did not come here seeking war," he said. "My grievance lies with individuals who betrayed my family years ago, not with the Blackthorn Kingdom as a whole. I am prepared to present formal evidence of that betrayal before a neutral council, evidence that implicates specific members of your own court in the conspiracy that led to my family's exile and my pack's destruction. And if this evidence proves accurate," Damien said, "what do you seek in return?" "Recognition of my rightful claim to the Ashworth territories," Cale said, "and formal acknowledgement of the wrongs committed against my family. I do not seek your throne, Damien Blackthorn. I seek only what was stolen from mine, and justice for those responsible. Damien considered this for a long moment, the practical wisdom of avoiding further bloodshed warring against the deeper, more personal grievance he carried regarding Elena's bond to the man standing before him. "And the matter of Elena," he said finally, unable to keep the topic from surfacing despite his intention to keep the negotiation purely strategic. "You are aware, I assume, that pack law requires formal recognition of any mate bond involving a healer bound in active service." Something hardened in Cale's expression at the mention of Elena's name, a protective edge entering his voice, despite his continued composure. "Elena chose this bond freely," he said. "I will not stand by and allow old pack law to be weaponized against a choice she made entirely of her own will, simply because it proves politically inconvenient for you." "You misunderstand my intention," Damien said, though even as he spoke the words, he found himself uncertain whether they were entirely true. "I have no wish to punish Elena for a choice that was, as you say, entirely her own. But the law exists, and I cannot simply ignore it without undermining the very authority that holds this kingdom together." "Then find a way to honor both the law and her choice," Cale said, "because I will not accept any resolution that treats her bond as a crime to be punished, rather than a decision to be respected." The two men stared at each other across the clearing, old instincts of territorial authority and protective possession simmering beneath the surface of both, and for a long moment, neither spoke, the tension stretching taut enough that even the accompanying guards shifted uneasily, hands drifting closer to weapons neither leader had yet given permission to draw. It was Torin who finally broke the silence, stepping forward carefully. "Perhaps," he said, addressing both leaders, "we table the matter of the bond for now, and focus instead on the evidence you claim to possess, Cale Ashworth. If your claims regarding a conspiracy within our own court prove accurate, that matter takes precedence over questions of pack law regarding personal bonds." Cale considered this for a moment before nodding slowly. "Agreed. I will present my evidence before a formal council within 3 days' time. I ask only that the council include neutral witnesses, individuals with no vested interest in protecting whoever may be implicated." "That can be arranged," Damien said, though his mind was already turning toward the growing suspicion he and Torin shared regarding Edmund Vance's unusual eagerness throughout the recent council discussions. The meeting concluded shortly afterward, both parties agreeing to a temporary ceasefire until the formal council could convene. Though the underlying tension between the two leaders remained entirely unresolved, simmering beneath the surface of every careful, formal word exchanged between them. As Damien rode back toward the Blackthorn camp, Torin studied him carefully. "You handled that with more restraint than I expected," he observed. "I am trying," Damien admitted quietly, "to be the kind of leader, and the kind of man, who considers what is right, rather than simply what protects my own pride. I do not know if I am succeeding." "It is a start," Torin said, "which is more than I expected from you a week ago, if I am honest." Damien said nothing further, his thoughts circling back, as they so often did now, to the image of Elena's hands clasped in Cale's grip, the golden warmth of a bond he had never managed to offer her himself. He understood, riding back toward camp beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain, that whatever resolution emerged from the coming days, he would need to face not only the political reckoning of Edmund's possible betrayal, but the deeper, more personal reckoning of everything he had lost through his own careless pride. That evening, back at the Blackthorn camp, Edmund approached Damien privately, his expression carrying its usual careful calm, though something beneath it seemed subtly different, more guarded than usual. "I understand the formal council has been scheduled," Edmund said. "Regarding the Ashworth heirs' claims of conspiracy." "It has," Damien confirmed, watching the older advisor closely. "I would advise caution," Edmund said. "Claims of old conspiracies are easily fabricated, particularly by a man seeking to legitimize an armed rebellion against established authority. I would not want to see this court's stability undermined by unsubstantiated accusations. The council will examine whatever evidence he presents on its merits," Damien said evenly, "regardless of who it may implicate. I would expect nothing less from any member of this court, particularly one who has served as faithfully as you claim to have, Edmund." Something flickered briefly across Edmund's expression, gone too quickly to fully name, before he inclined his head in careful deference and departed, leaving Damien standing alone, with a growing certainty that the coming council would reveal far more than simply the truth of an old betrayal. Elena, meanwhile, had spent the tense days following the parley meeting largely at the Ashworth camp with Cale, though she continued crossing regularly into Blackthorn territory to tend to soldiers still recovering from earlier skirmishes, a fact that drew curious and occasionally hostile glances from those Blackthorn soldiers who had heard rumors of her bond to the enemy commander. She bore these glances with quiet dignity, refusing to let the judgment of others shake the certainty she felt regarding her own choice. She found Damien one afternoon near the medical tent, the first time they had spoken directly since her return from the northern hills weeks earlier. He approached her carefully, his expression carrying none of the cold formality she had grown used to seeing from him in recent weeks. "Elena," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, long overdue and inadequate to whatever hurt I caused you. What I said in the Great Hall, months ago now, was cruel and untrue, and I have spent every day since regretting it, though regret changes nothing for the years of devotion you gave me that I failed, entirely, to properly value." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for the calculation she half expected to find there, some hidden motive beneath the apparent sincerity, and finding, to her genuine surprise, only quiet, unguarded regret. "Thank you," she said finally, "for saying that. It does not undo what happened, but I appreciate that you have said it regardless." "I do not expect it to undo anything," Damien said. "I only wanted you to know that I understand, now, what I lost through my own carelessness, and that whatever happens in the coming days regarding the Ashworth claims, I have no wish to see your happiness sacrificed to old pack law or wounded pride. You deserve better than that, Elena. You always did." She felt something loosen in her chest at his words, an old wound finally beginning to close, though the warmth she now carried for Cale remained entirely untouched by the exchange, steady and certain, in a way her old devotion to Damien had never quite managed to be. "I hope," she said gently, "that you find your own peace in all of this, Damien, whatever shape that peace eventually takes." He nodded, something almost like relief passing across his features, before he turned and walked away, leaving Elena standing alone near the medical tent, feeling, for the first time in a very long while, that some old debt between them had finally, quietly, been settled. She did not yet know that the coming formal council, scheduled for 3 days' time, would reveal a betrayal reaching far deeper into the Blackthorn court than anyone had yet suspected, a betrayal that would test the fragile peace between the two camps far more severely than any question of pack law or wounded pride ever could. That same evening, a rider arrived at the Blackthorn camp carrying sealed records from the castle archive, sent at Torrin's earlier request. He retreated to a quiet corner of the command tent and began working through the old documents by candlelight, searching for any mention of Edmund Vance's role during the years surrounding the original Ashworth conflict. Most of the records offered little of interest, routine council minutes and border reports that shed no particular light on the older advisor's history. But buried within a ledger of council appointments from nearly 2 decades earlier, Torrin found a detail that made him sit back slowly in his chair, a chill settling over him despite the warmth of the tent. Edmund Vance had not always served the Blackthorn court. According to the faded record, he had originally held a council position within the Ashworth pack itself, transferring his loyalty to Blackthorn territory only in the immediate aftermath of the Ashworth pack's sudden collapse, a transfer that had been quietly approved and never widely publicized, buried within the same period when the pack's ruling family had been exiled and its territory absorbed by neighboring lands. Torrin read the entry 3 times, making certain he had not misunderstood its implications. If Edmund had indeed served on the Ashworth Council during the very conspiracy Cale claimed had destroyed his family, his sudden transfer of loyalty to Blackthorn territory, immediately following that collapse, painted a deeply troubling picture, one that suggested far more than simple coincidence. He brought the record immediately to Damien, finding him still awake in his own tent despite the late hour, staring at nothing in particular, with the distracted weight of a man carrying too many unresolved burdens at once. "I found something," Torrin said, laying the ledger open on the table between them. Edmund served on the Ashworth Council before he ever came to Blackthorn territory. His transfer happened immediately after the pack's collapse, during the very period Cale claims the conspiracy against his family took place. Damien studied the record carefully, his expression darkening as the implications settled over him. "This does not prove his guilt outright," he said slowly, "but it certainly explains his eagerness throughout these recent council discussions to see any inquiry into the old conspiracy dismissed before it could gain real traction." "It explains a great deal," Torrin agreed grimly. "If Edmund played a role in the original betrayal, and has spent the years since quietly embedding himself within our own court, then his recent insistence on immediate military confrontation, rather than formal inquiry, makes considerably more sense. War would bury any investigation into old conspiracies far more effectively than negotiation ever could." Damien closed the ledger slowly, his jaw tight with the weight of what this discovery suggested, not only about the threat currently gathering along his border, but about the very foundations of trust his own court had been built upon for years. "We cannot move against him without more concrete evidence," he said finally. "A single transfer of loyalty, however suspicious in timing, is not proof enough of active betrayal." "No," Torrin agreed. "But it is enough to warrant careful watching, and enough to make me trust his counsel considerably less than I have in recent years. I will continue searching the records for anything more concrete before the formal council convenes in 3 days' time." Damien nodded, though his thoughts had already begun turning toward a darker and more uncomfortable possibility, one he voiced quietly into the candlelit tent. "If Edmund was indeed involved in the original betrayal of the Ashworth pack," he said slowly, "then Cale's grievance against my court runs deeper than either of us initially understood. It is not simply a matter of an exiled heir seeking to reclaim stolen territory. It is a matter of justice long overdue, buried within the very halls I have called home my entire life, hidden by a man I trusted enough to keep close counsel with for years." "If that proves true," Torrin said quietly, "it will change everything about how this conflict must be resolved, and about what kind of justice this kingdom owes, not only to Cale Ashworth, but to Elena, and to every soldier who has bled along this border, chasing a conflict that may have been entirely preventable, had the original betrayal simply been addressed honestly, all those years ago." The two men sat in heavy silence for a long while afterward, the weight of the coming days settling over both of them, uncertain of exactly what the formal council would reveal, but increasingly certain that whatever truth emerged would reshape not only the fragile peace between the two camps, but the very foundations of trust and authority the Blackthorn Kingdom had been built upon for generations. Outside, beneath a sky finally beginning to clear after days of heavy clouds, the camp settled into its uneasy nighttime quiet, soldiers on both sides of the border, resting as best they could beneath the fragile ceasefire, unaware that the coming formal council would determine far more than the fate of a single mate bond or a single border dispute. But the very question of who among them could truly be trusted, and who had spent years hiding a betrayal deep enough to have already cost countless lives, and nearly cost Elena her own happiness as well. The formal council convened 3 days later, in a large tent erected on neutral ground along the riverbank, the same clearing where Damien and Cale had first met to discuss terms. Neutral witnesses had been arranged as promised, respected elders from 3 separate territories with no direct stake in either the Blackthorn or Ashworth conflict, chosen specifically for their reputation of fairness and their distance from either court's internal politics. Elena sat near the back of the gathered assembly, beside Grace, watching as Cale took his place at the front of the tent, a small collection of documents and sworn statements laid carefully before him. Damien sat opposite, flanked by Torrin and the full Blackthorn Council, including Edmund Vance, whose careful composure gave no outward sign of the tension Elena now understood, having been informed by Torrin the previous evening, lay hidden beneath his practiced calm. "You have gathered us to present evidence," one of the neutral elders said, addressing Cale directly, "regarding a conspiracy you claim led to the exile of your family and the destruction of the Ashworth pack years ago. Present your case." Cale rose, his expression steady despite the enormous weight of the moment. 16 years ago, he began, my family ruled the Ashworth territory, a small but stable pack respected among its neighbors for fair governance and careful stewardship of its lands. My father was Alpha, my mother his trusted advisor, and I was their only heir, groomed from childhood to eventually take up leadership myself. He paused, gathering himself before continuing. The collapse came swiftly, and at the time, was explained to the wider pack as the result of internal weakness, a failure of leadership that left us vulnerable to absorption by neighboring territories. I was young when it happened, barely more than a boy, smuggled away by loyal servants during the chaos, while my parents were killed in what was called, at the time, an unfortunate uprising among discontented pack members. Elena watched Cale's expression carefully as he spoke, noting the careful control he maintained over words that clearly carried enormous personal weight, grief buried beneath years of practiced composure. I spent years afterward, Cale continued, living in exile, gathering what fragments of information I could about the true circumstances of that collapse. What I eventually discovered was that the uprising was not spontaneous at all, but carefully orchestrated by members of my own family's council, individuals who arranged for the territory's absorption into neighboring lands in exchange for positions of continued influence and authority within the pack that would benefit most from our downfall. He gestured to the documents laid before him. I present sworn statements from 3 former Ashworth servants who survived the collapse, each independently confirming that a senior council member arranged secret meetings with representatives of a neighboring pack in the weeks before the uprising, meetings that resulted in promises of continued authority in exchange for facilitating my family's downfall. The tent fell into tense silence as the neutral elders examined the documents carefully, murmuring among themselves before one finally spoke. These statements name no individual directly, the elder observed. Can you provide more specific evidence regarding the identity of this council member? Cale's gaze shifted deliberately across the tent, settling finally on Edmund Vance, whose careful composure faltered, almost imperceptibly, beneath the weight of that direct attention. I can, Cale said. The individual described in these statements currently serves on the Blackthorn Council, having transferred his loyalty to this territory in the immediate aftermath of my family's collapse. His name is Edmund Vance. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the assembled council, Damien's own expression hardening with grim confirmation of the suspicion he and Torin had carried since discovering the old record days earlier. Edmund rose slowly, his composure cracking further under the weight of every gaze now turned toward him. This is a fabrication, Edmund said, though his voice carried less conviction than the words themselves demanded. The unsubstantiated claims of an exiled heir seeking to legitimize an armed rebellion cannot be treated as credible evidence against a council member who has served this court faithfully for 16 years. Faithfully, Cale repeated, his voice carrying a controlled fury he had kept buried throughout his careful presentation until now. You call 16 years of hiding a betrayal that cost my family everything, that left me an orphan before I had even reached adulthood, faithful service. I would call it exactly what it is, Edmund Vance. A continuation of the same conspiracy that destroyed my family, carried out quietly, for 16 years, in plain sight. Torin stepped forward then, addressing the neutral elders directly. I have additional evidence to submit, he said, producing the old ledger he had discovered days earlier. This record confirms that Edmund Vance served on the Ashworth Council prior to his transfer to Blackthorn territory, a transfer that took place immediately following the collapse Cale Ashworth describes, and that was never widely publicized within our own court's history. The elders examined the ledger carefully, and the tent grew heavier with tension as the weight of corroborating evidence began to accumulate against Edmund, whose careful composure had now entirely abandoned him, his expression cycling rapidly between indignation and something closer to genuine fear. I ask that this council be adjourned, Edmund said, his voice sharper now, until I have had proper opportunity to prepare a formal response to these accusations. This is not a fair proceeding, conducted hastily on neutral ground with evidence I have had no time to properly review. You will have opportunity to respond fully, the presiding elder said calmly, but the evidence presented thus far, particularly the corroborating record submitted by the Blackthorn Beta himself, carries considerable weight. I would advise you to consider carefully whether continued denial serves you better than honest acknowledgement at this stage. Edmund's gaze swept the tent, taking in the grim, unwavering expressions of everyone present, from Damien's cold, controlled fury to Cale's barely restrained grief and anger, and something in his posture finally seemed to collapse under the accumulated weight of years of carefully hidden guilt. It was never meant to cost so much, Edmund said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier defensive sharpness. The original arrangement was meant only to shift influence, not to result in the deaths that followed. I did not order the killings that took your parents' lives, Cale Ashworth. That decision was made by others, once the uprising had already begun. Decisions that spiraled far beyond what I had originally agreed to facilitate. And yet you said nothing, Cale said, his voice hard. For 16 years you said nothing, while I grew up believing my family had simply failed, believing the collapse of everything I once knew was a matter of weak leadership, rather than deliberate betrayal. You let that lie stand, Edmund, for 16 years, while continuing to profit from the very conspiracy that orphaned me. I did, Edmund admitted, and something in the simple, unguarded honesty of that admission seemed to settle the matter more completely than any amount of further evidence could have managed. I have carried that guilt for 16 years, and I will not pretend now that guilt excuses my continued silence. It does not. The presiding elder turned to address the full assembly. The evidence presented, along with Edmund Vance's own admission, establishes clearly that a conspiracy did indeed take place against the Ashworth pack, facilitated in part by a council member who has since served within Blackthorn territory. This council recommends that Edmund Vance be stripped of his position and title, and that formal recognition of Cale Ashworth's claim to his family's territory be granted, alongside appropriate reparations for the harm caused by this long-hidden betrayal. Damien rose to address the assembly, his expression carrying the weight of a king confronting not only an external threat, but a betrayal that had lived quietly within his own court for years without his knowledge. This council accepts the recommendation, he said, his voice steady despite the visible strain beneath it. Edmund Vance is stripped of his title and position, effective immediately, and will face formal judgment before this same council regarding the full extent of his role in the original conspiracy. Cale Ashworth's claim to his ancestral territory is recognized, and this kingdom extends its sincere and long overdue apology for the role certain individuals within our own court played in his family's destruction. A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembly at Damien's willingness to accept the recommendation so readily, without the political maneuvering many had expected from a king facing such a significant loss of territory and influence. Elena, watching from the back of the tent, felt a swell of something close to pride at the sight of Damien choosing accountability over defensiveness, a choice she suspected would have been unimaginable from the man who had once dismissed her so carelessly in a crowded hall months earlier. The council began to disperse shortly afterward, Edmund led away by Blackthorn guards to await formal judgment, the assembled elders departing with murmured discussions of the historic significance of what had just been resolved. Cale remained standing near the front of the tent for a long moment, staring at the space where Edmund had stood, grief and relief and lingering anger warring visibly across his features. Elena crossed the tent to stand beside him, taking his hand gently in her own. "It is over," she said softly. "Whatever else follows now, the truth of what happened to your family is finally known. It does not undo what was lost," Cale said quietly, "but it matters, more than I expected it to," hearing him admit it plainly, after 16 years of silence. "It matters a great deal," Elena agreed. "Truth always does, even when it arrives far later than it should have." Damien approached them then, his expression carrying a formal but genuine respect Elena had not seen from him before. "Cale Ashworth," he said, "on behalf of the Blackthorn Kingdom, I offer my sincere apology for the role our court played, unknowingly, in the destruction of your family. Your claim to your ancestral territory is recognized fully, and I extend an offer of continued alliance between our two territories, should you wish to accept it, once the formal transition of your reclaimed lands has been completed." Cale studied Damien for a long moment, old wariness slowly giving way to something closer to cautious respect. "I accept your apology," he said finally, "and your offer of alliance, on the condition that this kingdom commits fully to the reparations promised here today, and to ensuring that no future conspiracy of this kind is allowed to take root within these halls again." "You have my word," Damien said, and extended his hand. Cale studied the offered hand for a long moment before finally accepting it, the two men shaking hands with the careful, formal respect of former rivals who had, through the events of that long and difficult day, found a path towards something closer to genuine understanding. Elena watched the exchange with quiet relief, sensing that whatever tension had once simmered between the two men, tension born of jealousy and wounded pride as much as territorial dispute, had finally begun to settle into something calmer, more honest. She did not yet know that the coming weeks would bring their own share of difficulty, as Chaol worked to formally reclaim and rebuild his shattered ancestral territory, and as Damien faced the harder, quieter work of rebuilding trust within his own court, after the revelation of Edmund's long-hidden betrayal. But for now, standing beside the man she had chosen freely, watching an old and terrible wrong finally acknowledged after 16 years of silence, Elena allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope, steady and real, for whatever came next. Edmund's formal judgment took place 2 days later, before the same assembly of neutral elders who had presided over the initial council. He offered no further denial, his earlier admission having already settled the fundamental question of his guilt, though he spoke at length about the pressures and threats he claimed had driven him toward the original arrangement, an attempt at explanation that the elders received with careful but unmoved attention. Elena attended the judgment alongside Chaol, watching as the man responsible for so much hidden grief finally faced consequence for his actions. The elders, after lengthy deliberation, ruled that Edmund would be stripped permanently of any position within Blackthorn territory, exiled from the lands he had spent 16 years quietly serving under false pretense, and required to contribute a significant portion of his accumulated wealth toward the rebuilding of the Ashworth territory as formal reparation for the harm his silence had helped sustain. "It is not enough," Chaol admitted quietly to Elena as they watched Edmund led away, following the judgment. "To undo what was lost. Nothing could be enough for that. But it is something. An acknowledgement, finally, that matters more than I expected it to." "Justice rarely undoes the original harm," Elena said gently, taking his hand. "It can only ensure the harm is not allowed to continue unaddressed. That is its own kind of worth, even if it cannot restore what was taken." Chaol nodded slowly, some of the tension he had carried throughout the proceedings finally beginning to ease from his shoulders. "I have spent so many years focused on uncovering this truth," he said, "that I did not fully consider what would come after. Once it was finally known, I find myself uncertain what to do with the quiet that follows." "Perhaps," Elena suggested, "you allow yourself to simply rest in it for a while, before turning immediately toward the next difficult task. You have earned that much, at the very least." He smiled at her then, something warm and genuine breaking through the heaviness of the day. "I do not think I have ever met anyone as wise as you, Elena Voss. I have had a great deal of practice," she said, tending to wounds far less visible than the ones I usually treat. In the days that followed, the Blackthorn court settled into an uneasy but hopeful period of transition. Damien worked closely with Torrin to review every decision Edmund had influenced during his 16 years of service, searching carefully for any further hidden consequences of the old betrayal that might still require addressing. He found the work humbling, forcing him to confront just how thoroughly he had trusted a man who had, for years, been quietly serving interests other than the kingdom's own. "I keep thinking," Damien admitted to Torrin one evening, reviewing yet another stack of old council records, "about how easily I trusted him, simply because he had served for so long, without ever once questioning whether that long service concealed something far darker beneath it. I wonder what else I have failed to see clearly, simply because I trusted the surface of things, rather than examining them more carefully." "That is a hard lesson," Torrin said, "but perhaps a necessary one. You have spent your reign, until now, ruling with confidence in your own judgment above all else. Perhaps this is the reminder you needed, that even a king's judgment benefits from careful scrutiny, and from surrounding himself with people willing to challenge him honestly, rather than simply agreeing with whatever he decides." Damien considered this for a long moment, the weight of the observation settling comfortably, alongside the other hard lessons he had absorbed over the past difficult weeks. "You have always been willing to challenge me," he said. "I do not think I have properly thanked you for that, in all the years you have served beside me." "You do not need to thank me," Torrin said, though he looked pleased regardless. "It is simply what friendship requires, when it is done honestly." Elena, meanwhile, divided her time between her ongoing healing duties within Blackthorn territory and increasingly frequent visits to the Ashworth lands, where Chaol had begun the slow, difficult work of rebuilding a territory that had sat neglected and diminished for 16 years. She found the work deeply meaningful, helping to re-establish a healer's hall within the reclaimed territory, training local villagers eager to learn basic medical care after years without proper healing services. She did not yet know that the peace settling over both territories, hard-won through the painful revelations of the recent weeks, would soon face one final test. As remnants of Edmund's old network, individuals who had quietly benefited from the original conspiracy alongside him began to grow uneasy at the prospect of further investigation, uncovering their own hidden roles in the betrayal that had shaped so much of the past 16 years. The trouble began quietly, as such things often do, with small disruptions along the border between the newly reclaimed Ashworth territory and the neighboring lands that had absorbed it years earlier. Reports reached Kale of supply caravans mysteriously delayed, of small fires set along the perimeter of villages still rebuilding after years of neglect, of unfamiliar faces spotted near the territory's edges asking careful, probing questions about the strength of Kale's newly gathered forces. Kale brought his concerns to Damien during one of their now regular meetings, held at a modest lodge established along the border specifically for the purpose of maintaining the fragile new alliance between their two territories. "These are not random incidents," Kale said, laying out several reports before Damien and Torin. "The pattern suggests coordinated effort, testing the strength of our defenses, rather than causing outright harm, at least for now." Torin studied the reports carefully. "This bears the marks of individuals with knowledge of the original conspiracy," he said grimly. "Edmund did not act entirely alone all those years ago. If others who benefited from the original arrangement have grown concerned about further investigation, uncovering their own roles, they may be attempting to destabilize the new alliance before that investigation can reach them. We need to identify who is behind this quickly," Damien said, "before these small disruptions grow into something more serious." Elena, present at the meeting in her capacity as a healer, familiar with both territories, spoke up thoughtfully. "I have noticed something similar during my recent visits to the Ashworth Healers' Hall," she said. "Several villagers have mentioned strangers, asking unusual questions, always framed casually, about troop movements and defensive positioning. I did not think much of it at the time, assuming simple curiosity given how much recent change the territory has experienced." "That fits the pattern," Torin said. "Careful, low-profile intelligence gathering, likely in preparation for something larger." The following days brought increased vigilance across both territories, guards stationed more carefully along vulnerable points, and quiet inquiries launched into the identities of the strangers Elena and others had reported. It was Grace, unexpectedly, who provided the breakthrough, recognizing one of the described strangers from an old encounter years earlier, during her own service within Edmund's original household staff, before she had transferred to healing work full-time. "His name is Colin Ashgrove," Grace told Elena with quiet certainty, recalling the visiting Alpha from the very night that had first set this entire chain of events into motion months earlier. "He served as a minor advisor within Edmund's circle years ago, before rising to lead his own smaller territory. I remember him from the few times he visited Edmund's household during my years there." Elena's breath caught slightly at the recognition. "The same Colin Ashgrove, who visited the Great Hall the night Damien first made his careless remark about me," she said slowly, pieces of a larger picture beginning to align in her mind. "He was there." He laughed along with Damien's dismissal. "It may be more than coincidence," Grace said carefully. "If Colin was already connected to Edmund's network at that time, his visit to Blackthorn territory that night may have served purposes beyond simple diplomatic courtesy." Elena brought this information immediately to Damien and Torin, and the revelation cast the entire chain of events from the past months in a startling new light. Torin moved quickly to gather what additional information could be found regarding Colin Ashgrove's territory and its history, uncovering, within a day's careful investigation, records suggesting Colin's small territory had grown suspiciously wealthy in the years immediately following the original Ashworth collapse, wealth that had never been adequately explained through the territory's modest agricultural output alone. "It fits," Damien said grimly, reviewing the gathered evidence with Torin and Kale in the lodge's small meeting room. "Colin Ashgrove benefited from the original conspiracy alongside Edmund, and has spent the years since quietly consolidating that stolen wealth into his own growing influence. The recent disruptions along the Ashworth border likely represent his attempt to destabilize the new alliance before further investigation can expose his own involvement." Kale's expression had hardened considerably throughout the discussion, old grief mixing uncomfortably with fresh anger, at the discovery that the conspiracy against his family extended further than he had initially understood. "If this proves accurate," he said, "we are not simply dealing with random disruptions along a border. We are dealing with a coordinated effort by someone with genuine resources and motivation to see this new alliance fail." "We need proof," Torin said, "before we can act formally against a neighboring territory's alpha, particularly one who has, until now, maintained a public reputation of neutrality in regional conflicts." Damien nodded slowly, already turning over the practical challenges of the situation. "I will send discreet inquiries to territories neighboring Colin's own lands," he said. "If his wealth and influence have grown as suspiciously as the records suggest, others within the region may have noticed as well, and may be willing to provide additional evidence once approached carefully." Over the following week, as these discreet inquiries proceeded, the small disruptions along the Ashworth border continued and gradually intensified, small skirmishes breaking out between Cale's newly organized forces and unmarked raiders, whose equipment and tactics suggested formal military training rather than simple opportunistic banditry. Elena found herself once again pulled into steady, urgent work, treating wounded soldiers, though this time the danger felt different, more personal, tied directly to the man she had bonded herself to, and the territory he was working so hard to rebuild. "I worry for you," Damien admitted to Cale, during one of their increasingly frequent strategy discussions, an admission that would have seemed impossible months earlier, given the tension that had once existed between them. "Not simply for the sake of the alliance, but because I understand now what Elena's happiness depends upon, and I would not wish to see that happiness threatened by a conspiracy neither of us fully understood until recently." "I appreciate the sentiment," Cale said, "though I intend to ensure my own survival regardless, for reasons that extend well beyond diplomatic convenience." The two men had settled, over the weeks since the formal council, into something approaching genuine mutual respect, though old instincts of rivalry occasionally still surfaced in quieter moments, a reminder of how complicated their shared history remained, despite the progress made toward alliance and understanding. It was Elena, ultimately, who provided the crucial piece of evidence that finally confirmed Colin Ashgrove's involvement, beyond reasonable doubt. While treating a captured raider's wounds following one of the border skirmishes, she recognized, quite by chance, a distinctive tattoo marking the man's forearm, one she had previously seen only once before, on a guard accompanying Colin during his brief visit to the Blackthorn Great Hall many months earlier. "This man serves Colin Ashgrove directly," she told Damien, and Torin immediately, describing the tattoo and its significance. "I remember it clearly from that night in the Great Hall, though I confess I did not think much of it at the time, given everything else occupying my thoughts." The captured raider, faced with this recognition and the mounting evidence already gathered against his employer, eventually confirmed under careful questioning that Colin Ashgrove had indeed orchestrated the recent border disruptions, motivated precisely by the fear Torin had originally suspected, concern that continued investigation into Edmund's old conspiracy would eventually expose his own long-hidden role in the original betrayal. With this confirmation in hand, Damien, Cale, and the same council of neutral elders who had presided over Edmund's original judgment convened once more, this time to address Colin Ashgrove's role in both the original conspiracy and the recent border disruptions carried out in an attempt to conceal it. Colin, summoned formally to answer these charges, arrived defiant and dismissive, confident that his careful years of consolidated influence would protect him from any serious consequence. That confidence proved badly misplaced. Faced with the accumulated evidence, the captured raider's testimony, and formal inquiries already circulating among neighboring territories regarding his suspiciously acquired wealth, Colin found himself with no credible defense remaining, his careful facade of neutral, unremarkable leadership finally and completely stripped away before the same assembly that had once judged Edmund Vance. The council's ruling came swiftly. Colin Ashgrove would face the same formal exile and reparation requirements previously imposed upon Edmund, alongside additional consequences for the recent border violence his hired raiders had carried out against Ashworth territory. His own small territory would be placed under temporary neutral administration until a suitable and trustworthy successor could be identified, ensuring the local population would not suffer further for their former leaders' hidden crimes. As the judgment concluded and Colin was led away, Elena found herself standing beside Cale, watching the final piece of the old conspiracy finally resolve after months of careful investigation and painful revelation. "It is truly over now," she said softly. Both men responsible finally held accountable. 16 years of hidden betrayal, finally brought fully into the light. "It is over," Cale agreed, though something in his voice carried a weariness that spoke to how much the entire ordeal had cost him, emotionally, as much as anything else. "I find myself uncertain what comes next, now that the singular purpose that has driven me for so many years has finally been achieved." "What comes next," Elena said gently, taking his hand, "is simply living, Cale. Building something new, together, on ground finally cleared of the old betrayals that have haunted it for so long." He looked at her then, something soft and grateful passing across his features, the weight of years finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. "I would like that very much," he said quietly, "more than I have allowed myself to want anything in a very long time." Neither of them yet knew precisely what shape that future would take, but standing together in the aftermath of justice finally served, both felt, for the first time and longer than either could easily remember, that the path ahead, however uncertain, was finally clear of the shadows that had haunted it for so long. That evening, Damien sat alone in the small lodge that had become the regular meeting place for the two territories' leadership, reviewing the final reports from Colin's judgment with a quiet, contemplative weariness. Torrin found him there, settling into the chair across from him with 2 cups of warm tea, rather than the wine he usually preferred, sensing that the occasion called for something steadier. "You have been quiet since the judgment concluded," Torrin observed. "I have been thinking," Damien admitted, "about how much of my own leadership these past years was built on trust I never properly examined. Edmund, Colin's easy welcome into our court that night in the Great Hall. I surrounded myself with the appearance of loyalty, without ever questioning whether that appearance concealed something else entirely. You are not the first leader to make that mistake," Torrin said gently, "and you will likely not be the last. What matters now is what you do with the lesson, going forward." Damien turned his cup slowly in his hands, watching the steam curl upward into the cool evening air. "I have been thinking too, about Elena," he said quietly, "about how easily I mistook her quiet devotion for something owed to me, rather than something freely given and deeply valuable. I wonder how many other things I have failed to properly see clearly, simply because I never learned to look carefully enough." "That is a harder lesson to sit with," Torrin said, "but perhaps the most important one to come out of everything that has happened these past months. Leadership built on assumption, rather than genuine attention to the people around you, is a fragile thing, Damien. I am glad to see you finally understanding that, even if the understanding arrived through considerable pain." "I do not know if I can undo the pain I caused her," Damien admitted, "but I intend to spend the rest of my reign, at the very least, ensuring I do not repeat the same carelessness with anyone else who serves beside me." Torrin studied his old friend for a long moment, something warm and genuinely proud settling into his expression. "That is a good place to begin," he said. "Better late than never, as the old saying goes, though I would gently suggest you have proven that particular lesson rather more dramatically than most." Damien allowed himself a small, tired laugh at that, the first genuine humor he had shown in what felt like a very long time. "I suppose I have," he agreed. In the weeks that followed, life across both territories began settling into a steadier rhythm, free for the first time in 16 years, from the hidden shadow of conspiracy and betrayal that had quietly shaped so much of the region's recent history. Cale continued the careful work of rebuilding his ancestral lands, welcoming back scattered members of the old Ashworth pack, who had heard news of his successful claim, and returned, one by one, to help restore what had been lost. Elena divided her time increasingly between the two territories, her healer's hall in the reclaimed Ashworth lands growing steadily busier as more villagers arrived seeking care and training. Damien, for his part, threw himself into the harder, quieter work of rebuilding trust within his own court, reviewing every remaining council appointment with newfound care, and establishing, at Torrin's gentle suggestion, a formal system allowing servants and lower-ranked pack members to report concerns directly, without fear of dismissal, a system designed specifically to prevent any future Edmund from operating unchecked within the halls of power, for 16 years without challenge. He also began, slowly and carefully, rebuilding something closer to genuine friendship with Elena, free now of the old romantic expectation that had once complicated their relationship, replaced instead by a quieter, steadier respect that both found, somewhat to their surprise, considerably more comfortable than what had come before. Elena found she could speak freely with Damien now, about her work, her hopes for the rebuilding Ashworth territory, even her happiness with Cale, without the old ache of unrequited longing coloring every exchange between them. "I am glad," Damien told her honestly, during one such conversation held in the quiet garden of the Blackthorn Healer's Wing, "that you found someone who sees you as clearly as you deserve to be seen. I regret, deeply, that it was not something I managed to offer you myself, but I am glad, regardless, that you found it." "Thank you," Elena said, and meant it fully, the old wound finally settling into something closer to simple, peaceful history, rather than lingering pain. "I hope you find that same clarity for yourself, Damien, with whoever eventually earns the privilege of standing beside you." He smiled at that, something genuine and hopeful in the expression. "Perhaps, in time," he said. "For now, I find I am simply grateful for the chance to be a better king, and a better friend, than I managed to be before." As autumn began settling over the two territories, bringing with it the first cool winds signaling the changing season, both Elena and Cale found themselves increasingly drawn toward a quiet but significant question neither had yet spoken aloud, the matter of a formal mate ceremony. A public celebration of the bond they had formed privately months earlier, beneath a star-filled sky at the edge of a border camp that had, since then, become the unlikely birthplace of an alliance between two territories, and the unexpected beginning of a peace that would shape the region for years to come. The idea of a formal ceremony first arose quietly, during a peaceful evening walk along the river that had once marked the tense boundary between two hostile camps, and now served as a gentle reminder of how far both territories had come. Cale raised the subject carefully, watching Elena's reaction as he spoke. "I have been thinking," he said, "about how our bond began, quietly, at the edge of a battlefield, without ceremony or witness beyond the stars themselves. I do not regret how it happened. I would not change a single moment of that night, but I find myself wanting, now, to celebrate what we have built together, openly, in front of the people who have come to matter to us both." Elena considered this for a long moment, warmth spreading through her chest at the thought. "A formal ceremony," she said slowly, "would mean a great deal, I think, not only to us, but to everyone who has watched this alliance form, from something so uncertain, into something worth genuinely celebrating." "Then you would want this?" Cale asked. "A public ceremony, joining our bond formally, before both territories?" "I would want it very much," Elena confirmed, and the smile that broke across Cale's face at her answer was one of the most unguarded expressions of joy she had yet seen from him. Word of the planned ceremony spread quickly through both territories, met with genuine enthusiasm from villagers and soldiers alike who had, over the recent difficult months, come to see the bond between Elena and Cale as something of a symbol for the fragile new peace between their two lands. Preparations began in earnest, a joint effort between Ashworth villagers, eager to celebrate their returning heir's happiness, and Blackthorn servants who had, over the years, grown genuinely fond of the healer who had served them faithfully for so long. Damien offered the use of the Blackthorn Great Hall for the ceremony itself, a gesture that carried significant symbolic weight, given the hall's history, as the very place where his careless words had first set this entire journey into motion. Elena, when the offer was extended, found herself surprised by how readily she accepted, understanding intuitively that reclaiming that space for a moment of genuine joy would serve as its own quiet, powerful closure to the pain that had once defined it. "Are you certain," Cale asked her gently, when she explained her reasoning, "that you wish to hold our ceremony in the very place where you were once so carelessly dismissed?" "I am certain," Elena said firmly. "That hall holds one memory of a moment when my worth was denied. I would like it to hold a second memory now, of a moment when that worth was celebrated fully, by everyone who matters. I do not wish to avoid that space forever, carrying old pain with me every time I think of it. I would rather transform it." Cale studied her with visible admiration. "You continue to surprise me," he said, "with how thoroughly you understand your own strength." The ceremony was set for the first evening of the new season, and as preparations continued, Elena found herself increasingly occupied not only with the details of the celebration itself, but with her ongoing healing duties, which had grown considerably busier as both territories continued their steady rebuilding. It was during this busy period that a final, unexpected complication arose, one neither Elena nor Cale had anticipated. A young Ashworth villager arrived at the healer's hall late one evening, breathless and clearly frightened, carrying urgent news. "There are strangers gathering near the old northern quarry," the young man reported to Elena, who immediately sent word to Cale, while continuing to question the messenger for further details. "Armed, and moving carefully to avoid the main patrol routes. My brother spotted them while hunting, and rode back immediately to warn us." Cale arrived at the healer's hall within the hour, his expression tense as he reviewed the report alongside Torin, who had traveled to the Ashworth territory that same week, to assist with final security preparations ahead of the upcoming ceremony. "This could be nothing more than ordinary bandits," Torin said carefully, drawn by the increased activity and resources flowing into the territory during the rebuilding effort. "But given everything we have already uncovered regarding Edmund and Colin's old network, we cannot afford to assume the best without careful investigation." "I will lead a scouting party myself," Cale said, already moving toward the door. "Let me come with you," Elena said immediately, though Cale turned back with visible reluctance. "It could be dangerous," he said. "I would rather you remain safely here, particularly with the ceremony so close now." "I have faced danger at your side before," Elena reminded him gently, "at the very border camp where this entire journey began. I do not intend to start hiding from it now, especially when my skills as a healer may prove necessary, regardless of what your scouting party discovers." Cale studied her for a long moment, old protective instinct warring against his genuine respect for her strength and capability, before finally nodding in reluctant agreement. "Stay close to Torin," he said, "and if things grow dangerous, you retreat immediately. Promise me that much at least." "I promise," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, some quiet instinct told her the coming hours would test that promise more thoroughly than either of them yet anticipated. The scouting party rode out under cover of darkness, moving carefully toward the northern quarry, where the strangers had been reported. As they approached, Cale signaled for the group to dismount and continue on foot, moving quietly through the rocky terrain that had once served, generations earlier, as a defensive stronghold during the original Ashworth Pack's earliest years of settlement. What they found, upon reaching a vantage point overlooking the quarry itself, confirmed their worst fears. A sizable group of armed strangers, perhaps 30 in number, had established a hidden camp within the quarry's natural shelter, their equipment and careful discipline suggesting formal training rather than opportunistic banditry. More troubling still, Torin, studying the group carefully through the darkness, recognized several faces among them as individuals who had served within Colin Ashgrove's own territory before his recent exile. "These are Colin's people," Torin whispered to Cale. "Loyalists who escaped formal judgment when his territory was placed under neutral administration. They must have been gathering here, planning something, likely retaliation for his exile." Before Cale could respond, a sharp cry rang out from further down the quarry's edge, one of their own scouts having been spotted by an alert sentry among the hidden camp. Chaos erupted immediately, the hidden strangers scrambling into defensive positions, as Cale's scouting party found themselves suddenly exposed and badly outnumbered. "Fall back toward the tree line," Cale ordered urgently, drawing his weapon, as the first of the armed strangers began advancing toward their position. Elena, heart pounding, moved quickly to help an injured scout who had taken a glancing blow during the sudden confusion, applying pressure to the wound even as the chaos of combat unfolded dangerously close around them. The fight that followed was brief but fierce, Cale's forces fighting with disciplined skill against an enemy that, despite their numbers, lacked the coordinated leadership needed to press their advantage effectively. Torin fought at Cale's side with the practiced ease of a veteran warrior, the two of them cutting a path through the chaos toward the quarry's central camp, where the group's apparent leader, a hard-faced woman Elena did not recognize, was attempting to rally her scattering forces. "Stand down," Cale called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced considerably worse than a hastily assembled band of loyalist retaliation. "Your leader has already been judged and exiled. Continuing this fight accomplishes nothing beyond further bloodshed that serves no one. The woman studied him for a long moment, weighing her rapidly diminishing options, before finally lowering her weapon with visible reluctance. "We only sought to reclaim what was owed to us," she said bitterly, "after Colin's exile stripped away positions and livelihoods we had built over years of loyal service." "Then bring your grievance formally before the Neutral Council," Kale said, "rather than through armed conflict that only risks further harm to people who bear no responsibility for whatever Colin promised you. That is the same council that judged him fairly. It will hear you as well, if your grievance carries merit." The remaining fighters, recognizing the hopelessness of their position and the genuine reasonableness of Kale's offer, gradually laid down their weapons, the brief and unexpected conflict finally drawing to a close, without the significant bloodshed that had seemed, only minutes earlier, dangerously close at hand. Elena moved quickly among the wounded on both sides, tending to injuries with the same careful, steady skill she had shown throughout every difficult moment of the preceding months, understanding intuitively that healing, in this moment, mattered more than questions of loyalty or blame. As the sun began rising over the quarry, casting pale golden light across a scene that had, only hours earlier, seemed poised for serious tragedy, Kale found Elena finishing her treatment of the last wounded fighter, her hands steady despite the exhaustion visible in her posture. He approached quietly, relief and admiration warring visibly across his tired features. "You were magnificent," he said softly, settling beside her as she finished wrapping a bandage. "Steady through all of it, exactly as you have been through everything else this journey has demanded." "I simply did what needed doing," Elena said, though she allowed herself a small, tired smile at his words. "As did you, ending this without further bloodshed when it would have been easier, in the moment, to simply press your advantage." "I have learned, this past year," Kale said, "that strength without mercy accomplishes very little worth having in the long run. I would rather build something lasting than something merely victorious." Elena leaned against him then, exhaustion finally catching up with her fully now that the immediate danger had passed. "Whatever wisdom guides you," she said quietly, "I am deeply grateful to have found my way to your side." They returned to the Ashworth Healers' Hall by midday, word of the quarry confrontation already spreading through the territory, carrying with it renewed appreciation for the careful, measured leadership Kale had shown throughout the unexpected crisis. Damien, arriving later that same day to check on preparations for the upcoming ceremony, listened with evident concern as Torin recounted the full details of the encounter. "This confirms," Damien said grimly, "that Colin's influence ran deeper than we initially understood, and that the work of fully securing this fragile new peace remains far from finished." "It does," Kale agreed, "but it also confirms something else, I think, that this alliance, however difficult its beginnings, is worth defending fully, together, rather than facing separately, as two isolated territories, still recovering from old wounds." Damien nodded slowly, something like genuine respect settling into his expression, as he studied the man who had once been his rival, now standing firmly as a partner in the harder, ongoing work of building lasting peace, across a region too long, shaped by hidden betrayal. "Then let us ensure," he said, "that the ceremony proceeds as planned, a celebration not only of your bond with Elena, but of everything this alliance has already overcome, and everything it still promises to build." As evening fell over the Ashworth territory, Elena finally allowed herself to rest, the exhaustion of the long, dangerous day finally catching up with her fully. She fell asleep with Kale's steady presence beside her, grateful beyond measure for the strange and difficult path that had led her from a moment of quiet humiliation in a crowded hall to this hard-won, deeply earned peace, still uncertain of every challenge that remained ahead, but steady now, in the certainty of who stood beside her to face it. The woman who had led the Loyalist fighters at the quarry, whose name proved to be Nora Fenwick, was brought before the same Neutral Council in the days that followed, honoring the offer Kale had extended during the chaos of their brief confrontation. She spoke plainly of the years she had spent serving Colin Ashgrove's territory, of promises made and broken, of livelihoods lost overnight, when his exile stripped away the positions many had depended upon, without any warning or transition support. The council, weighing her testimony carefully, alongside the undeniable fact of the armed confrontation she had led, ultimately ruled with measured fairness, acknowledging the legitimate grievance underlying her actions, while still requiring formal accountability for the violence carried out at the quarry. Nora and her followers would face a period of supervised service within the newly administered territory, working to help rebuild the very community structures Colin's greed had left neglected. A sentence designed to address genuine harm, while also offering a path toward eventual redemption, rather than simple punishment alone. "It is a fair resolution," Cale observed to Elena afterward, as they walked together through the Ashworth village, now bustling with preparation for the approaching ceremony. "Colin used these people as much as he used my family's stolen legacy. Punishing them as though they bore equal responsibility would have been its own kind of injustice. You have grown wiser than the man I first met by that low fire," Elena said, smiling up at him. "Though I confess I found that man quite compelling as well." "I have had considerable motivation to grow wiser," Cale said, "given everything these past months have demanded of me. And I have had, I think, rather excellent guidance along the way." The days leading up to the ceremony passed in a flurry of joyful preparation, the Ashworth village transforming steadily as returning pack members and enthusiastic Blackthorn volunteers worked together to restore the territory's ceremonial hall, long neglected during the 16 years of the pack's exile. Elena found herself deeply moved by the sight of elderly Ashworth villagers, some who had survived the original collapse as children themselves, working alongside young Blackthorn soldiers to hang fresh garlands and repair weathered stonework, the shared labor itself becoming a quiet symbol of the alliance being celebrated. Grace arrived from Blackthorn territory a week before the ceremony, bringing with her a carefully wrapped bundle that she presented to Elena with visible emotion. "This belonged to my own mother," Grace explained, unwrapping a simple but beautifully embroidered shawl, worn at her own mate ceremony many years ago. "I have kept it safe since her passing, waiting for an occasion that felt worthy of it. I can think of none more fitting than this one." Elena accepted the gift with tears gathering in her eyes, moved deeply by the older healer's generosity. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, Grace. For your guidance these past 3 years, for your honesty when I needed it most, and for this kindness now. You have earned every bit of happiness coming to you, child," Grace said, embracing her warmly. "I am only glad to have witnessed the journey that brought you here." Damien, too, found himself increasingly involved in the ceremony's preparation, contributing resources from Blackthorn territory and working closely with Cale on logistical matters that required careful coordination between the two allied lands. Their working relationship, forged through the difficult months of shared crisis, had settled into something Elena found genuinely heartening to witness. Two men who had once regarded each other with wary suspicion, now collaborating easily, even sharing occasional dry humor during their planning sessions. "I never expected," Damien admitted to Torin one evening, reviewing final preparations for the approaching celebration, "to find myself so invested in celebrating another man's bond with the woman I once cared for, and yet here I am, genuinely looking forward to it." "Growth often surprises us that way," Torin said. "I am proud of you, Damien, for how far you have come since that careless night in the Great Hall. Not many men would have handled the consequences of that mistake with the honesty and accountability you have shown these past months." "I had considerable help," Damien said, "from a friend willing to challenge me honestly, even when I did not wish to hear it." Torin smiled at that, raising his cup in a small, informal toast. "To hard lessons, honestly learned," he said, "and to the better king and better man they helped shape." As the evening of the ceremony finally arrived, the Blackthorn Great Hall transformed entirely. From the cold, formal space, Elena remembered, from the night of her humiliation months earlier. Warm light from countless candles filled the room. Fresh flowers gathered from both territories adorned every surface, and the assembled guests, a joyful mixture of Ashworth and Blackthorn villagers, soldiers and dignitaries, filled the hall with a warmth and celebration entirely unlike the cold formality it had once held. Elena stood at the hall's entrance, wearing Grace's mother's embroidered shawl over a simple but elegant gown, her heart pounding with anticipation as she prepared to walk toward the man waiting for her at the hall's center, the same space where she had once been so carelessly dismissed, now transformed into the setting for the happiest moment of her life. The great hall fell into a hushed, expectant silence as Elena stepped through the entrance, every face turning toward her with warm anticipation. Grace stood near the front of the gathered assembly, tears already gathering in her eyes. Torrhen stood beside Damien, both men watching with genuine, unguarded happiness that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. And at the center of the hall, standing tall and steady beneath the soft candlelight, waited Chaol, his expression carrying a depth of joy and wonder that stole the breath from Elena's chest the moment their eyes met. She walked slowly through the gathered crowd, past familiar faces from both territories, villagers she had treated, soldiers she had healed, friends who had supported her through the difficult and transformative months that had led to this moment. She thought, as she walked, of the frightened, heartbroken young woman who had once slipped silently from this very hall, certain that her worth had been permanently dismissed by the very person she had devoted years of quiet, unspoken love toward. That woman felt impossibly distant now, replaced by someone steadier, surer of her own value, who understood, finally and completely, that true worth had never depended on another person's recognition of it, but had simply needed the right person to see it clearly and celebrate it openly. She reached Chaol at the hall's center, and he took her hands in his with a tenderness that seemed to still every worry, every lingering doubt, every echo of old pain that space had once held for her. "You look radiant," he said softly, for her ears alone, though his voice carried easily enough in the hushed silence that several nearby guests smiled at the words. "You look rather pleased with yourself," Elena said, a teasing warmth in her voice that drew a soft laugh from him, breaking some of the formal tension of the moment. The presiding elder, the same figure who had overseen the earlier council proceedings that had brought such significant justice to both territories, stepped forward to begin the formal ceremony, his voice carrying warmly through the hall, as he spoke of the sacred nature of the bond being celebrated, of the journey that had led two people from vastly different circumstances toward a connection strong enough to help heal not only their own hearts, but an entire region long divided by hidden betrayal and old grief. Elena and Chaol exchanged the formal vows their tradition required, though both had insisted on adding their own words as well, quiet promises spoken directly to each other, rather than simply the ritual phrases tradition demanded. "I promise," Chaol said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes, "to see you always, fully and honestly, exactly as you are, and to never once take for granted the extraordinary gift of your trust and your love. I promise to build with you a life where your worth is never questioned, never dismissed, but celebrated every single day we are given together." Elena felt tears gathering as she listened, and when it came her turn to speak, she found her own voice steady, despite the depth of feeling behind her words. "I promise," she said, "to meet your honesty with my own, always. To stand beside you through whatever challenges still await us, as we have already stood together through so much. And I promise to never again mistake quiet devotion for love that does not also choose to see me clearly, because you have taught me the difference, and I will not forget that lesson." The hall erupted into warm applause as the ceremony concluded, the formal bond between them now recognized fully and publicly before both territories, a celebration that carried far greater meaning than a simple joining of two hearts, representing also the hard-won peace between two lands that had, only months earlier, stood at the edge of devastating conflict. The celebration that followed stretched long into the night, music and laughter filling the transformed great hall, the joyful noise a stark and healing contrast to the cold, formal silence that had once defined the space during Elena's years of quiet, unacknowledged service. She danced with Chaol beneath the warm candlelight, surrounded by friends from both territories, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, entirely and completely happy. Damien approached her during a quiet moment later in the evening, when Chaol had stepped away briefly to speak with several visiting Ashworth elders. "I wanted to tell you," Damien said, "how genuinely happy I am for you, Elena. Watching you today, I found myself thinking of everything this past year has taught me, about pride, about the true cost of careless words, and about what it actually means to value someone properly, rather than simply assuming their devotion as something owed." "Thank you, Damien," Elena said warmly, "for everything, including the honesty you have shown these past months, in acknowledging what happened, and working genuinely to be better because of it. That matters more than you may realize." "I hope," Damien said, "that this alliance between our territories continues to grow and strengthen, long after tonight's celebration fades into memory. And I hope, selfishly perhaps, that our own friendship continues alongside it. I would like that very much, Elena said, and meant it entirely. The old wounds between them finally, fully healed into something steadier and more honest than either had once imagined possible. As the evening wound toward its close, Elena found herself standing near the hall's entrance, the same doorway where she had once stood frozen with heartbreak months earlier, listening to words that had, at the time, felt like the complete dismissal of everything she believed her life was meant to hold. She looked back across the transformed hall now, filled with warmth and celebration and genuine joy, and felt the last lingering shadow of that old pain finally, completely dissolve. Cale found her there, slipping an arm gently around her shoulders as he followed her gaze across the celebrating crowd. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "I am thinking," Elena said, leaning into his warmth, "about how strange it is that the very words meant to diminish me ended up leading me here, to you, to this entire journey that taught me my own worth so much more thoroughly than quiet devotion ever could have. I do not know if I would choose to undo that pain, even if I could, given everything it eventually led toward. I am deeply grateful for wherever it led you," Cale said, "though I confess I am equally grateful it will never need to happen again." Elena laughed softly, turning to face him fully. "No," she agreed, "I do not believe it will." They stayed together at the celebration until the very last guests finally departed, the great hall gradually emptying of its warm crowd, until only the two of them remained, standing quietly amid the fading candlelight and the lingering scent of flowers gathered from two now firmly united territories. In the months that followed, Elena and Cale settled into a life neither could have imagined possible during the earliest, most painful days of this journey. Cale continued the steady work of rebuilding his ancestral territory, welcoming increasing numbers of scattered Ashworth Pack members home, while Elena expanded her healers' hall to serve both communities equally, training new healers eager to carry forward the same skilled, compassionate care she had shown throughout the difficult months of conflict and reconciliation. The alliance between the two territories grew steadily stronger, formalized eventually into a lasting partnership that brought prosperity and stability to a region that had, for 16 long years, struggled beneath the weight of hidden betrayal and quiet grief. Damien ruled with newfound wisdom and humility, his court rebuilt on stronger foundations of genuine accountability and careful attention, lessons learned through painful but ultimately transformative experience. And Elena, standing one quiet evening beside Cale at the edge of their reclaimed Ashworth lands, watching the sun set golden over territory finally at peace, understood fully and completely the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 careless words, spoken in a moment of thoughtless pride, had once threatened to define her entire sense of worth. Instead, they had become the unlikely beginning of a path that led her toward genuine love, toward justice long overdue, and toward a peace between two kingdoms that neither Damien nor Cale could have achieved alone. She had learned, through every difficult step of that journey, that her worth had never depended on being valued by someone unwilling to truly see her. It had simply waited, patient and unshaken, for someone capable of recognizing it fully, and celebrating it, not with careless words in a crowded hall, but with steady devotion, honest partnership, and a love strong enough to help rebuild not only 2 broken hearts, but 2 broken kingdoms as well. The story that had begun with dismissal ended, finally, in belonging, proof enough, Elena thought, watching the last light of sunset fade gently over the peaceful hills, that even the deepest wounds could become, in time, the foundation for something far stronger and more beautiful than anyone standing in that crowded hall so many months earlier could ever have imagined. A full year passed before Elena found herself standing once more in the Blackthorn Great Hall, this time for a far different occasion, a formal gathering celebrating the first anniversary of the alliance between the two territories. The hall was filled again with familiar faces, many of whom had grown considerably closer over the intervening months, friendships forged across old boundaries that had once seemed impossibly rigid. Grace, now working alongside Elena's own trained healers in both territories, approached her during the celebration with a warmth that had only deepened over their years together. "I remember," Grace said, glancing around the transformed hall, "standing in the healer's garden with you, a heartbroken young woman, uncertain of her own worth. I could not have imagined, even then, how far you would travel from that moment. Neither could I, Elena admitted, smiling. Though I am deeply grateful for every difficult step of the journey, even the parts I would not have chosen for myself. Torin joined them shortly afterward, his usual easy humor evident despite the formality of the occasion. Damien tells me the Ashworth Healers Hall has grown considerably since your last report, he said. Nearly a dozen trained healers now serving the reunited territory, and requests arriving from neighboring lands, seeking similar training programs. The work has grown beyond anything I imagined when we first began rebuilding, Elena confirmed. Though I suppose that mirrors the growth we have all experienced this past year, in one way or another. Kale found her later in the evening, drawing her gently away from the celebration, toward a quiet corner of the hall, near the same doorway where she had once stood frozen with heartbreak, now simply another familiar corner of a space that held far more joyful memories than painful ones. I have news, he said, his expression carrying a warmth she had come to recognize as reserved for moments of genuine significance. Good news, I hope, she said, studying his face carefully. The Council of Ashworth Elders has formally requested, he said, that we consider establishing a permanent seat of shared governance between our two territories, recognizing the alliance not simply as a temporary arrangement born of crisis, but as a lasting partnership meant to endure for generations. They have asked whether we might be willing to help lead that effort. Elena considered this for a long moment, warmth and quiet pride swelling in her chest at the thought of the legacy such an effort might build, not only for their own future, but for every villager and soldier and healer who had suffered through the long years of hidden betrayal that had once divided their two lands. I would be honored, she said finally, to help build something lasting, from everything we have already overcome together. Kale smiled, pulling her close. I hoped you would say that, he said softly. Though I confess, I would have supported whatever answer you gave, simply grateful for the chance to build any future alongside you, large or small. They stood together for a long while in that quiet corner, watching the joyful celebration continue around them. Two territories once divided by 16 years of hidden grief, now bound together by genuine friendship, hard-won justice, and a love that had grown, against every early expectation, from a moment of careless cruelty into something far stronger and more enduring than either could have imagined possible. Damien, observing the quiet exchange from across the hall, felt a swell of genuine happiness for the two people who had, through their own courage and honesty, taught him more about leadership and love than any advisor or old tradition ever had. He thought, briefly, of the careless words he had once spoken in this very hall, words that had set an entire chain of transformative events into motion, and found himself grateful, in a way he could not have imagined feeling a year earlier, for the painful lesson those words had eventually taught him. He raised his cup quietly, a private toast offered to no one in particular, though his gaze rested warmly on Elena and Kale across the celebrating hall. To second chances, he thought, and to the hard, honest work of becoming better than the mistakes that once defined us. The celebration continued long into the night, laughter and music filling the great hall that had once witnessed such quiet heartbreak, now transformed permanently into a place of genuine warmth and belonging. And as the stars rose over both territories, finally united in lasting peace, Elena Ashworth, no longer the healer once dismissed as meaning nothing, stood proudly beside the man who had taught her otherwise, ready to build whatever future still awaited them, together, one honest and steady day at a time.